Guy Burgess. Burgess also had a history of communism at Cambridge. But Arnold Deutsch realized that Burgess's homosexuality and brazen attitude about it put him completely outside the then current profile used by MI5. For those matters just about anybody at that time, for what communists would look like in their private lives. Accordingly, in 1935, Deutsch sent Burgess to the far-right fascist homosexual type of ruling class highbrow set. Specifically, he directed Burgess to Army Captain Jack McNamara, a Tory fascist MP, and member and leader of the Anglo-German Fellowship, a Brit-Nazi front organization, with the same kind of outlandish homosexual reputation as Guy Burgess. The two traveled together to Germany and but fucked their way through the Nazi Party's equivalent to the less public but just as real, left-wing Ham in turn. When not sucking Nazi cock, Burgess kept himself busy sodomizing the French War Minister Edouard Daladier. January 1936 May 1940, Private Secretary Edward Pfeiffer. During 1936, Burgess worked his way inside the homosexual underground at the BBC in London, and via them was made a BBC producer. Keep in mind that in the 1930s a homosexual who wanted to survive had to hide his sexual preferences as much as an actual foreign agent would have had to hide his true allegiance, which meant that there were many at the BBC as well as everywhere else who would help a fellow of their type. As far as his new Chika boss Theodore Malley, see below for Malley's arrival, was concerned, Burgess was inside, in many ways. In December 1938, Burgess got himself recruited into MI6. Kim Philby. Kim Philby had a tougher road to hoe. First, there was his own record of Cambridge communism and the fact that he had been an active communist in Vienna and had married a communist Jewish girl. As history would show, MI5 missed most of the Austrian experience. What they did not miss, Hollis was able to get rid of in the years that followed Philby's July 1934 London-given Chika directive for him to plan for MI6 penetration. And by the time 1940 rolled around, MI6 had gotten used to recruiting young men who had had a flirtation with communism at college. Everyone agrees Hollis was in MI5 in 1940, and Hollis certainly did clear Philby. In 1935, Philby's biggest problem was his father. St. John Philby was from an old and reliable ruling class family in service to the oligarchy, but in India, he had turned anti-British renegade. To get an idea of what alienated St. John Philby from the British Raj in India, I recommend the M. Forster book and movie A Passage to India. At any rate, after India, St. John made his way to Arabia and became the key advisor to Ibn Saud, who by this time was the top anti-Brit tribal boss and nominal king of Saudi Arabia. In the latter regard, St. John had rejected Christianity and taken up the Islamic Sunni religion of the Wahhabi sect. He had taken an Arabian wife younger than his son, with his first wife, undivorced, living in England. All of this convinced the Lords of Whitehall that his scion, Harold Adrian Russell, Kim Philby, should be watched carefully and for a long time, before even considering him for membership in their august halls. Accordingly, Orloff kept Philby on ice until history provided the perfect route to the penetration of MI6, which turned out to be Spain. That would not begin until the end of 1936, when Philby arrived in Spain as a foreign correspondent for the Evening Standard, and soon thereafter the London Times, attached to the fascist side in February 1937. By that time his old London boss, Orloff, was the boss of all Soviet operations in Spain, and it turned into a perfect segue. Burgess got Philby recruited into MI6 in the summer of 1940. Blunt and Hollis saw to it that Philby passed MI5 background scrutiny. Philby then went into the same section as Burgess, which was at first called Section D, Guerrilla Operations, and later renamed as the Special Operations Executive, SOE. Along the way, in 1940, his first MI6 assignment was in cryptology, and Kim became a member of the Double Cross XX-20 committee, and was accordingly read in on the Ultra Decoding Project and the Enigma decoder machine itself. All of this immediately ended up on Joseph Stalin's Staraya Street desk in Moscow. For an entertaining made-for-TV 3-part series about the Brit Ultra code breaking, take a look at The Bletchley Circle, 2012, at Netflix. Anthony Blunt. Anthony Blunt, the next member of the Magnificent Five to be recruited, was the first on the potential recruit list of Arnold Deutsch when he returned to London. Deutsch was now definitely out from under the MI5 cloud, thanks to Hollis having ditched all the incriminating reports, and or having explained them as mistakenly interpreted. Deutsch recruited Anthony Blunt in January of 1937. Blunt was in fact the fourth man that the Brit press would be searching for 30 years later after the Burgess, Maclean, and Philby defections. It would take, however, 40 years to unmask Blunt, who was recruited into MI5 in the summer of 1940. And he was the fourth Chika spy of the Mag-5 to be recruited. And he was another Cambridge man of correct family and with a brilliant academic record, and a homosexual. Blunt was the first of the Chika recruits to be placed inside MI5, as opposed to MI6 where all previous Chika agents had been assigned. John Cairncross. The final Brit recruit of the Mag-5 was John Cairncross. And so he was the real fifth man, not Michael Straight, whose inclusion here would make it the Ring of Six, but since Straight was only recruited in the UK, his immediate transfer to North American control takes him out of this Ring of Five. James Klugman, a leader of the CPGB and member of its Politburo, approached Cairncross for Soviet controller Theodore Mali. Then he was handed off to Arnold Deutsch, who reported to Mali in May of 1937 that Cairncross was on board. To recap, all the five were recruited in the 3 years from 1934 to 1937. Cairncross had a public reputation as an intellectual communist theoretician at Cambridge, but an even stronger reputation as a genius in languages and linguistics. He aced his Foreign Service exam 100 points higher than anyone else that year, but of course ran into trouble when his communist background was thrown up to him by the interviewing examiners. In May 1937, Deutsch instructed Cairncross in how he would have to proceed to clean up his past. This instruction was done on a park bench at a secret rendezvous in Regent's Park. Cairncross operated inside the Foreign Service from a different office than McLean, so that reports of. The two gave a binary 3D stereoscopic perspective to Red intelligence inside the Baldwin-Chamberlain plot against the USSR. Michael Straight. Blunt led Deutsch to the US-American Michael Straight, who was an undergraduate at Cambridge, wealthy, and a secret communist. John Cornford had just been killed 2 weeks earlier, December 28, 1936, in the Spanish Civil War. John Cornford and Michael Straight had been close friends at Cambridge. Straight joined the Chayka immediately upon being interviewed by Deutsch. Shortly thereafter he graduated and returned to the US, and Deutsch told him to whom to report in New York and gave him half of a picture he, Straight, had drawn to match up with the half his US controller would have. At this point, 1937, Straight moves out of the Cambridge grouping and into a new US group of spies, which is another subject. Orloff again. Orloff knew he would need help in London in 1936. Especially as he had been notified at the end of 1935 that Stalin wanted him back in Moscow permanently no later than the 1st of March of 1936 for a mission that was still unknown to him. See Chapter 13 below. Stalin sends Orloff to Spain. Accordingly, Orloff moved Theodore Mali to London in January 1936 and in May 1936. Not long thereafter Orloff had departed London for Moscow, and Mali took over as boss of the Chayka's legal residency in the United Kingdom. In the meantime, Philby had joined his mentor Alexander Orloff in Spain, and here his control passed to Leonid Eidingen, deputy illegal resident in charge of Spain under Orloff, when Orloff was reassigned to New York in January 1938. You will follow Philby's Spanish career elsewhere in this book, Chapter 13. Eidingen followed Orloff to the Western Hemisphere and became his chief in charge of Mexico, and the Trotsky 1940 assassination, also discussed in detail in Chapter 13, and the Chayka's Latin American operations in 1939. In that capacity he operationalized the Mexican backdoor to the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos for Orloff and Orloff's new understudy, who arrived in New York in October of 1941, as Master Adam Spy-to-be, Alexander Feklisov. Feklisov has written his own book The Man Behind the Rosenbergs, 2001, Alexander Feklisov and Sergei Kostin, Enigma Books, New York, 430 pp. In June of 1937, Theodore Mali was recalled to Moscow and Deutsch followed in November 1937. After this time the entire Mag-5 in London, Burgess, McLean, Cairncross and Blunt, Philby was in Spain, were out of contact with any Chayka control for 9 months. After the clean-up of West European intelligence and the removal of Chayka chief Nikolai Yezhov in Moscow, and his replacement by Beria, contact was re-established. In summary, McLean and Cairncross were by 1937 firmly ensconced in the British Foreign Office. Burgess managed to get himself into MI6 in December of 1938. Burgess would clear the way for Philby's recruitment into MI6 in the summer of 1940 with Hollis' MI5 approval. Blunt, who had originally been a Chayka recruit, became the first of the five to be inserted into MI5 rather than MI6, and this happened in the summer of 1940. Burgess was perhaps the most energetic of the Mag-5. His success was enhanced by his homosexuality, which served to keep him in a perennial bachelor status, and thus up and around at all hours of the day and night making contacts and networking. However, that may have been, he was always true and blue and enthusiastic in his pursuit of espionage goals, whether he had a Soviet controller or not. Also, it is important to remember that McLean, Burgess and Philby were all friends and all knew of each other's secret roles for Soviet intelligence, and because they were loyal, true and blue, they could help each other, with or without help from Moscow Central, or any controller for that matter. Finally, Stalin had kept the two operators, Red Army Intelligence and the Chayka, completely without knowledge that each was running its own network in the UK. This policy had originally been instigated by Felix Dzerzhinsky and continued by the boss after Dzerzhinsky's death without Menzhinsky, Yagoda or Yezhov having any idea. The next Chayka chief to know this would be Lavrenti Beria. Chapter 13 World War II. The imperialist encirclement. There had never been any doubt in the minds of our Bolshevik leaders that they would eventually have to fight another great conflict. Lenin's doctrine of keeping the capitalist countries divided, formally begun with the 1922 Rapallo Treaty, could not last forever. But if it were to last long enough to allow us Bolsheviks to prepare for the great conflict, in whatever ways were available, then that would be good enough. It was the most basic Marxist science that the class struggle had to be played out internationally as well as nationally. We were, after all, after them. We were devoted to our last breath and first aspiration to the liquidation of the capitalist class worldwide. Likewise, they were devoted to our destruction. There would not be, nor could there be, according to our historical science, that is to say our historical materialist theory of social and cultural evolution, anything other than a final climactic class war planet-wide. From 1924 to 1941, as it turned out, we had only 17 years to jockey for the best position from which to fight that final battle or battles. Final battles would turn out to be a century away, but in the meantime this battle against world imperialism would fill the bill. From 1917 to 1941, our northern frontier was protected by the Red Army and Navy, and the then solid ice pack that existed through much of the year restricting imperialist naval thrusts. Our southern frontier was protected by the Himalayas and deserts and backward areas such as Persia, Afghanistan, and northwest China, which imperialism would find it difficult if not impossible to utilize for a broad attack on us. Thus our problems were east and west. East against Japan and the USA, and west against Germany, Italy, Great Britain, France, and the lesser fascist countries of Iberia and East Europe. We will begin with the Western Front. The Western Front. Along the way, from Rapallo, April 1922, to June of 1941, there were numerous conflicts between the Soviet Republic, after 1924 the Soviet Union, and the rest of the capitalist world. Perhaps the most difficult was the opening shot of World War II, that of Spain, 1936 to 1939. Not because of the military complexity of the armed struggle, for that was none too unusual, but for the international political gamesmanship of the 1930s, where the capitalist classes of France and England were busy trying to pacify Hitler, which is to say busy encouraging Hitler to turn his attention to his oft-stated goal of war with us, the USSR. They were trying to provoke the Soviet Union into one or another trap. A traps that would have the effect of making it easier for their governments to appease Hitler, and turn against Stalin and the rest of us also, and to attack us together. This de facto imperialist conspiracy was the entire substance and foreign office focus of British and French ruling class policy from 1926 until the actual turn of the coming World War in 1941. I once heard in Portland, Oregon in 1963, Hyman Loomer, plus a leading member, lecture on this subject, and one important point I recall was his opinion that FDR was at best neutral and at worst pro-fascist, that is from 1933-1937, but as time progressed FDR tended toward neutrality, and then outright hostility to European fascism. Subsequently, I spent over 40 years following the information flow and have been able to confirm this thesis. I think Stalin was sensitive to this evolution of FDR and the New Deal, and this sensitivity provides an understanding of the reason for Stalin's decision in the early phases of the Spanish Civil War to pull Orlov out of Spain and send him to New York in 1938. After the events of 1933 and 1934, in Germany and Russia the Soviet Party authorized a step-up in war industry and a restoration of command ranks of the old Tsarist variety in the army. In 1935, names given during the Civil War to the officer and NCO ranks reverted to the traditional rank titles as the USSR prepared for war, the officers and NCOs being rewarded accordingly. A new highest rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union, equivalent to a US 5-star general, was created. 5 4-star generals got that honor. The Chinese had been fighting fascism since 1927, as we have seen. For us communists in the USA, it was in Spain we first confronted modern fascism. For the Soviet Union too, Spain would be where world socialism and our armed forces first tested our instruments of war against theirs. World War II began, in reality, in Spain, in July, on the 17th, 1936, although we Bolsheviks would not be in that war formally for another 5 years. That is, until June 22, 1941. Let us take a closer look. The Spanish Civil War, July 17, 1936 to April 1, 1939. The Spanish kingdoms of Isabel and Fernando, Castile and Aragon, emerged from the 1492 discovery of the New World and the nearly simultaneous discovery by Portuguese explorers of the Muslims circumventing Cape of Good Hope tip of South Africa, route to the South Asian and Far Eastern parts of the Old World, having put a permanent mark on Spain's subsequent socio-cultural evolution. And that of Portugal too, of course. Namely by creating national enterprises bent on looting, as opposed to producing commodities to acquire wealth. By stealing the gold, silver, and slave labor of the Americas, tremendous quantities of capital were accumulated in the hands of the feudal ruling classes of Spain and Portugal. Isabel wore the pants, literally, in the Fernando relationship. She was not some kind of sheltered fairy tale princess. She put together the army that conquered Muslim Spain and the secret police force keeping her and Fernando in power as Queen and King of Castile and Aragon, and their newly emerging Spanish kingdom. In the process, she expelled the Islamists and the Jews. She appeared frequently at the head of her army, mounted, in leather from head to toe, booted, in tailored Spanish chain steel armor. What Isabel wanted, Isabel got. Just to be sure, she had her always present guardian force, the Hermanidad, of privileged thugs who became her Praetorian Guard, and secret police. To see her will was made so. The global ideological agent of Isabel was the Pope of Rome, Alexander VI, the former Archbishop Borgia, Isabel's lover and sycophant. Borgia declared the world divisible between two papist powers, Spain and Portugal. The Pope drew a line for Isabel, dividing the entire world. He was giving virtually the entire Western Hemisphere to Spain and everything east of the line to Portugal. East of that line included the eastern promontory of South America, thus Portugal got what is now Brazil. And so the world was divided effectively for 2 centuries as far as the bosses of Europe were concerned. But the point is that the two superpowers of Europe, Spain and Portugal, were bent on looting hard gold and silver, not on manufacturing commodities. Needless to say, Isabel's suborning of the papist authority to the monopoly on enslavement and exploitation of the New World, leaving Britain and Northern Europe out of the picture altogether, was a de facto declaration of war. That is, war against emerging Protestant Europe. This became a war between the papal superpowers against England and Northern Europe. Spain against the rest of Europe, especially the Netherlands and England, countries it wanted anyway, for their capitalist component. Thus in the 1500s, Anglo-Protestant Europe was continuously in a sub-Rosa Cold War of sorts, as in the historically and dramatically excellent Cate Blanchett movies, Elizabeth and Elizabeth, The Golden Age. Nonetheless, the intercontinental conflict was deadly, as the Iberian New World colonies would testify, as raid after raid became their lot. In 1588, the Spanish royal family nobility oligarchy made a fateful final error. They suffered a massive naval defeat in their attempt to invade and occupy Great Britain. Not only would the victorious Spanish have divided all of the land and wealth, but done so with the stated objective of destroying Protestant power in England and bringing Elizabeth to Rome for a public burning. The Spanish failed, learning in the process that captains of FedEx shipments of stolen New World gold and Manila galleons filled with Far Eastern riches were not automatically qualified to be captains of war vessels. With a little help from the weather, the Limeys managed to fight off the invasion and drive it to self-destruction against its North Sea escape route. At any rate, the Iberian road to riches stood and stands in direct contrast to the British way, which involved producing commodities for sale at home and abroad. The British had to go the Cap route because they were locked out of the Western Hemisphere. The New World was Spanish until the 1588 debacle. British, Dutch, and French military ability to challenge the Spanish monarchs emerged. But by that time the Protestants had gone the capitalist route. Initially it had been far less profitable, but like it or not, in those pre-1588 days the capitalist route was their only route. Supplemented along the way with a lot of piracy, buccaneering, or if you prefer, privateering, in the Caribbean, as well as exploration with a view to colonization of the Indian subcontinent. For an entertaining view of this early Caribbean period, I recommend the Geena Davis 1995 movie Cutthroat Island, based loosely on the adventures of several female pirates of some renown and one socialist pirate who ended up in Madagascar, which gives an entertaining and technically correct view of the British New World in 1668, which was only the Caribbean and New England. Australia and New Zealand not yet discovered. Another recent Star series is Black Sails, which gives an excellent view of life in Nassau that was the prime Brit privateer base. For an excellent view of the latter part of this 400-year period, 1810, I recommend the Annie series Horatio Hornblower. The more recent Russell Crowe movie Master and Commander, Far Side of the World illustrates the condition of terminal feudalism/early capitalism in Europe's Napoleonic Wars. As does the 17-part Richard Sharp TV series, Bernard Cornwell. I spent a year in Nassau, Bahamas studying this history. Unbeknownst even to themselves, in the long run the British and the French were on the far better road to super-profit creation via capitalism than the Spanish. It took history 400 years to catch up with the Spanish. Even so, it is an interesting dialectical conundrum, for while the Spanish path aimed as it was at avoiding class antagonisms known to be associated in the rest of Western Europe with capitalism of the industrial variety, which might have generated a fatal weakness in their system, in the short run, it was simultaneously weakening Spain vis-a-vis England and France, in the long run. As the nature of West European and North American economy began to shift to manufacturing, even ever so marginally at first, the shift was simultaneously being made into whose hands actual cash and commodities were accumulating. No longer was the ruling class source of wealth the farmers held in servitude as serfs, or slaves in Eastern Europe, but the workers paid by the hour, and thus the capitalists were without the additional burden of having to feed and house their labor force, which if held in absolute servitude would have to be fed and housed all year round. Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations notes this fact on page 1. He points out that the capitalist route was the much more economical one. This to this day is still why capitalist wage slavery is the normative preference over master-slave stage, chattel slavery. Now the owner of the means of production simply dismissed labor when no longer needed, and those thus dismissed were on their own. Serfs and slaves have to be fed and housed all year round by their masters and mistresses. Workers for wages were, and are, fucked after working hours. Freedom is not free. Constant struggle for schools and health care is required. Thus, over a period of several centuries, the hand of the manufacturing and financial bourgeoisie grew until they became the determining factor in Anglo-American politics. The class whose policies, the Spanish in the New World or the Portuguese in the Old, were leaving the historical scene. James Clavell's book Shogun illustrates perfectly the role played by British privateers in breaking the Portuguese Catholic Church control of European trade with Japan and China. As such, I consider his book also to be a good introduction to the National Geographic's World's Toughest Prison series. See the show on Santa Marta, Mexico and Lurigancho, Peru. Clavell's East Asia series is essential reading for who have not had personal experience in the Far East. Clavell spent World War II interned in a Japanese prison camp outside Singapore city called Changi. These prison experiences later provided the basis for his first book and movie, King Rat. Changi was very much like the gringo-sponsored and financed prison in Peru called the Lurigancho Center for Social Readaptation in Lima, about which I have written 2 books concerning my own experiences, Rivers of Blood, High Finance South American Style. These books are now available in ebook format. www.amazon.com. Kindle Books. What I Left Behind is shown several decades later in the National Geographic Channel. World's Toughest Prisons. Show about the Lurigancho Penitentiary, Lima, Peru, where prisoners still run the place. A practice I established as described in Rivers of Blood and High Finance South American Style. Thanks but no thanks. Furthermore, in those 4 centuries, 1518 to 1921, the feudal ruling classes considered Spanish industrialization at home in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon to be completely out of the question. They knew if they allowed the emergence of mercantile capitalists possessing commodities often created by proto-machinofacture and its essential use of labor power as the source of all wealth in these factories, they would also be creating their own grave diggers. 1. 2. That is, the creation of an industrial proletariat would be terribly destabilizing, industrial workers being far more difficult to control than landless agricultural workers. Furthermore, and at that time most importantly, some of the small bourgeoisie would become big bourgeoisie quickly, and many of them would be financially very well off. Inevitably, this would mean the king and his court, not to mention the nobility, would soon come under their sway, become their lenders and bankers, as their class aristocrat brothers had in every other European country. Thus, the Iberian monarchs decided for industry they might have to have, and for the profits that came from the creation of capitalist proto-commodities, they would grab as grab can in the rest of Western Europe, thereby achieving this objective. We'll take capitalism our way, thank you. This is why, in the second half of the 1500s, Philip's Spain took military aim at the Netherlands and England. And in a more sophisticated way earlier Isabel had taken aim at the workshops of Italy, installing her lover, bribing the voting cardinals, the infamous Archbishop Borgia, as Pope of Rome, changing his name to Alexander VI. Meanwhile, Spain's resources were devoted to the tiny ruling class behind these monarchs, which is to say their luxurious lifestyles, and to the construction of a powerful naval force to control these new global provinces. By placing capitalism in its true form outside the boundaries of Castile and Aragon, the Spanish feudalist rulers secured the labor and social peace they wanted at home, and for a long time. No need for public education here, beyond the guilds necessary to construct powerful Manila galleons, so the early start the Spaniards had made in terms of education was reversed. The reversal lasted nearly 4 centuries and featured a steady decline in public education, including higher education, where 60-odd universities were reduced to 15 and more lower-grade education handed to the religious authorities of Roman Catholicism, so that so-called public education in Iberia resembled so-called public education in the contemporary Islamic world. For the powers that be, the ruling aristocrats and their nobility, it was a system which had worked very well. If it had not been for the U.S. declaration of war against them in 1898, as far as they were concerned, and like our contemporary imperialists they were ignorant and blind to history, the old regime could have gone on forever. Spain forced into the 20th century. However, it was the War of 1898 against the North Americans which brought a new day to the Iberian Peninsula, at least in the Spanish part of it. The gringos wanted the Spanish road into China, and it was this they got when they defeated the pitiful naval squadrons of the Spanish and seized the Philippines. The Cuban part of this Spanish North American War was just an excuse, and gringo intervention there had to happen that year unless the gringos were ready to let Cuba win its independence on its own merits, given the advances of the Cuban revolutionary forces of José Martí. The Philippines had been the major road into China for Europeans for all of these 4 centuries, and at one time in the 1500s and 1600s the only road. The gringos wanted it, knew they could seize it, and proceeded to do so. Again, for fascinating insights into the status of Europe with the Far East in 1600, read James Cavell's Shogun. The Philippines. The loss of the colonies, especially the Philippines, to the U.S. meant large numbers of de facto expelled overseas Spanish expatriate capitalists would make their way back to their homeland, bringing with them the technology of capitalism they had been using to create profits overseas. So in the early 1900s, the arrival of Spain's foreign expatriate capitalists and their new class technocrats doomed Spain's old order. 20 years later. But the old regime would not go quietly, so Spain became the center in the 1920s of an intense intra-bourgeoisie struggle and an intra-feudal classes struggle. These struggles were intense precisely because the returnees would not wait. Too many years had gone by already. The idea of waiting was dead on arrival. The newcomers wanted modern government and modern property concepts to go along with their technology, and would not take no or later for an answer. Practically, realistically, how could they take no or later for an answer when their entire way of making money, earning a living, depended on industrial manufacturing? Consequently, the returning expatriate capitalists had been linking up with like-minded Spaniards at home. The feudalist monarchy would have to give way to a capitalist parliamentary system where the bourgeoisie could settle their differences among themselves. These struggles were being exacerbated simultaneously by an increasingly aggressive working-class movement in the towns and cities and in the countryside. What would happen? Beginning in 1931, with the election of a parliament and the abdication of the king, Spain began a downward spiral towards civil war that climaxed on July 17, 1936. That was the date of the revolt of Spanish fascist army officers against the newly elected Popular Front government of the Republic. In other words, the fascist revolt was a direct response to the election of a communist-encouraged Popular Front government. They won, we lost, and why? However, the reality was that while the elected parliament was definitely radical, it was just as clearly not a communist government. If it had been a Bolshevik government, such as we had in Russia after October 1917, the way the Spanish Civil War could have been conducted would have been entirely different. The truth was that the Spanish ruling classes had assumed the worst, us in power, and struck a preventive first blow. The reality was that we Bolsheviks had helped place in power in Madrid a Mickey Mouse coalition of incompetent boobs. In the end, the Spanish ruling families were right to do, from their perspective, what they did, because we could not stop them, even after over 2.5 years of civil war. Even when world fascism was completely destroyed in 1945, the Spanish ruling families continued in power in Spain for the rest of their lives. In fact, they still are in power, albeit for many years under a social democratic regime. Now in 2018, Spaniards are rediscovering the lessons of their own civil war, namely, that capitalist governments are at bottom all the same. The only answer to the present crisis is working-class communist revolution. Remember this as one more lesson about social democracy. It is just a cover, better called social fascism, that always betrays workers in the last analysis. Working class factor. Anarchism, perhaps the most pernicious anti-working class ideology then operating in Europe, had had success in northern Italy, Russia, and Spain. During the 1800s, it was such a serious threat to proper working class ideology that General Secretary Karl Marx sent the First International of Workingmen away from Europe to the USA. In the US, the then, 1876, 19 chapters of North American Communist First International Workers dissolved it altogether, as Marx had wished, and went on to create their own Workingmen's Party of the USA. Pick this up in Part 3. However, in Spain, the anarchists had created a following among the oppressed masses of landless agricultural workers in places like Catalonia and Andalusia. For us in North America, think of the Grange, if you are familiar with it, as I, from Idaho, grew up with, and its agrarian radicalism, over the last century or so, and you will have a rough idea of what this kind of thinking amounts to, although, in North America the farmers involved were far better off than those who had literally nothing in Spain. Yet the rural political idiocy of the European illiterate, and thus uneducated, peasant farmers shines through. This anarchist tradition among the landless agricultural laborers of Spain provided the base upon which the trade union form of anarchism could and did build as the returning capitalists began creating factories in Catalonia and Andalusia. One can see in that, what Karl Marx called the idiocy of rural poor ignorant peasant. Landless worker life meant among other things the only relationship these oppressed masses had had with any state, army and police, for 6,000 years was one of being the subjects of insatiable tax collecting. This was the extreme and unjust extortion the rulers insisted upon, rulers who saw to it a host of inhuman indignities were visited upon the lower-than-farm animals' farmer population, regularly. The idea that the state, the army and police, any state, any army and police, is the source of all evil found easy acceptance among this mass of dehumanized poor. This is all mass-based anarchism is in reality. That is all it has ever been. Mature intellectuals here and everywhere should already have learned this, and most have. But there are still those around too lazy to undertake a scientific study of history. Marx and Engels proved what the state is, and archaeology has confirmed that judgment. Lay of the land. From 1902 to 1909, Spanish anarchist leaders built a following among the industrial proletariat emerging in the new capitalist factories originating in this rural hell. These are the anarcho-syndicalists, syndicate being another than popular term for unions. In 1909, they created their first national trade union called the CNT, which stands for Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, National Work Confederation. Syndicalism is the theory that workers can take control of a nation simply by taking control of shops, factories, farms, and other enterprises without first confronting and destroying the bourgeois state. Marxism was not without adherents in Spain. It had its own union called the UGT, General Workers' Union, and with the return of the expatriate capitalists it began to grow rapidly. Proper Marxism, Bolshevism, calls for armed confrontation with the capitalist state and its destruction before workers can proceed to construct socialism. But there are Marxists and there are Marxists. It was not until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 that correct Marxism, Leninism, the PC, Partido Comunista de la España, really took off, jumping from perhaps only 10,000 members in 1918 to 200,000 members by 1919. It was, however, still quite small compared to the 700,000 members in the anarchist CNT that year. In the succeeding decade, the UGT grew to 1 million members, as did the CNT, and the landless agricultural workers were a larger class still at over 2 million. The UGT was still quite divided, revisionists versus revolutionaries, in terms of socialist objectives, and had of course an underlying strong trade union issues orientation. So as 1936 dawned, the CPSU-B General Line, thus, the Comintern General Line, had only the very small Spanish Communist Party, PC, representing it in Spain. Against that stood not just this massive anarchist problem but the additional complication of real Trotskyists and a plethora of so-called independent Marxist groups, including what quickly became a de facto quasi-Trotskyist ultra-left party called the PUM, which roughly translated stands for Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, under the leadership of Trotsky's former personal secretary Andrés Snin. Finally, there was the Socialist Party of Spain, the principal party in the UGT, which Stalin wanted in 1936 in unification with the Communist Party of Spain, PC. The Socialist Party leader furthest to the left was Francisco Largo Caballero, who had taken on the title of the Spanish Lenin, but he was far from that. Largo Caballero did not want to unify with the communists, and this, along with other fallings out, led to his early replacement as the Civil War unfolded. In May 1937, after the siege of Madrid was lifted and our international brigades had led the counterattack, throwing the fascist forces and their 150,000 Italian troop allies well back on their heels, Largo Caballero was tossed out as Prime Minister of the Spanish Republic and replaced by Dr. Juan Negrin. The truth is, there was no Spanish Lenin. Nor could the Comintern make one out of the raw material available, which included the best of the Spanish Marxists such as Dolores Ibárruri. Stalin knew all this and had sent his favorite Chekist, Alexander Orlov, to make a personal tour of the Spanish situation in the spring of 1936. Orlov left behind a working cadre of Chekists in key cities to support the Republic should Stalin decide to do what he was thinking about in April and May of 1936. Stalin did decide to act by way of sending volunteers and instructed Orlov to make up for lost development time in what might otherwise have been a typical party-building exercise in a de facto third world, colonial-type country. Orlov did his best, but in the end nothing the Soviets did could turn Spain into a country with a unified working class under Leninist leadership in the short time available. Technological and political status of Spanish capitalism. Spanish capitalist technological applications were not restricted to mining and agriculture but were making rapid inroads in far more complex technological areas such as aircraft construction. For example, the best airplane engine of the entire First World War was built in prototype form by the Spanish steel complex and auto manufacturer Hispano-Suiza. The actual construction shifted immediately to the advanced capitalist countries for use in the air war of that great conflict, 1914 to 1918. Spain did not have the manufacturing capability yet to produce aircraft by mass production, but it definitely had the core of scientists and engineers from which such capability could be built. In the years after World War I, Spanish capital and its workers got on with the job. 30 years later. However, in the 30 years following the end of the US-Spanish War, the returning expatriate Spanish capitalists had had an insufficient amount of time to come up with a unified national political solution to their problems. As we have seen, these were problems peculiar to the stunted developmental road Spain had been following for 4 centuries. The new would-be rulers had to confront the socio-cultural consequences of problems that face any nation undergoing rapid social and cultural evolution, not to mention this specific developmental inheritance. That 4th-century historical interregnum of national technological stagnation acted to drag the entire nation behind as it attempted to hothouse its way into the modern capitalist world. As in China, it would be the criminal element within the capitalist class which came to the rescue. Meyer Lansky, Bigger Du, and Chiang Kai-shek had a new equal, and his name was Juan March. Background: Inside Snapshots, United Front Against Fascism, 7th Comintern Congress. July 25 to August 20, 1935. George Dimitrov, I needed to see you before this extremely important Comintern Congress. I understand, Comrade Stalin. I know how important this United Front Against Fascism strategy is going to be, and I don't see any real problem since the Trotskyites are not present, and even if they were, the program is so far left it effectively negates any united front with the Social Democrats. Fuck them and listen to what I have to say. You have no idea how many foreign capitalist plots the Chika uncovers on a daily basis against our socialist motherland. In Western Europe there is just one fascist coup attempt after another, and eventually one of them in some unlucky country is successful. I don't give two sweet fucks about strategy agreement. What I want is for the British comrades to stand up and stop British intervention against us, no matter how it is disguised. Karl Marx stopped this exact same class of motherfucking cocksuckers. This is the best my limited ability at English interpretation can give the Russian profanity. Edition, from entering the American Civil War on the side of the slavocrat regime in Richmond, and I expect them to do the same thing now. And, the French comrades and so forth. Marx did it on his own and forged an alliance of working class elements, and financed it with international union contributions. He didn't have an entire state apparatus and its financial resources to help him as they now have. God damn it, I expect them to start effectively standing up against the fascist capitalists' plot to form a united front around the London-Berlin-Rome axis for World War II against us. Now do you see? No. Not exactly, Comrade Stalin. Jesus fucking Christ, George, you are as loyal a comrade as there is, but you are fucking dense. You need to use this Comintern Congress to fire up the comrades to stand up with armed resistance in France, England, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so forth. Wherever they can, they should stand up and fight back in armed strikes and hopefully armed insurrection against this international capitalist war policy against us. Guns in the streets, George, against fascism, and force the Social Democrats to take our side or theirs. They have to learn how to fight fascism in practice. Our unions are. To make it clear that these democratic parliamentary countries will not countenance a joint attack with the fascist states against us, or face civil war. Buy me more time. Believe me when I tell you I am pushing our labor power beyond its possibilities as it is. Even so, I have to have at least 5 more years of freedom from war to finish our minimum industrialization, and we need our foreign comrades to fight against war and for peace with us. Comrades in the UK and France and anywhere where the fascists don't already have complete control. The boss rested and waited. I see, Comrade Stalin. Okay, I'll do it. It's not exactly how I plan to implement a united front policy with the Second International, but I think I see what you mean, and I certainly understand why. That's it, George, you come and see me when the Congress is over. The boss walked to the door, opening it, indicating as he did that the Comintern's new leader, George Dimitrov, was dismissed. The boss was still pissed off, thinking, this Dimitrov is too stupid to run this thing, for Christ's sake, why did I pick him? Back at his desk, Stalin hit the intercom button. Poskrbyshev, where is Molotov? On his way, boss. Show him in when he gets here. Trotsky and Stalin had been the only ones with access to Lenin unannounced. With Stalin, no one had access without announcement. No one had access without being fully searched. Just in case, Stalin had a BOLO .30 cal Mauser pistol popular with Bolshevik officers and noncoms, holstered under his military jacket, and a Tommy gun under the desk. In his office and on the floor of whatever car he was riding in, which itself was changed daily. Molotov entered as Poskrbyshev opened the door, announcing, Comrade Molotov. Vlad, refresh my memory. Why did I pick this Bulgarian Dimitrov last year? I don't know how many you consulted, but when you asked me I recommended him. Now, before you explode, Koba, let me say I know what you are thinking. But Dimitrov has strong points, not the least of which is he reads every petition and letter sent from every comrade, not to mention from every party, and he responds to each thoughtfully and personally. He spends so many hours at work his colleagues call him Stone-ass. So, that's why you picked him, he has your nickname. Molotov continued unfazed. He is well liked, and especially admired after he stood up to Hitler over the Reichstag fire. He is certainly well-meaning, with an outstanding class and political background. What he lacks in audacity or quick reaction capability can be made up by close advisors, and I have several for you to look at. Also, we can bolster his good points as well with a larger and better organized secretariat. In short, don't worry. I understand the situation and have it in hand. Thank you, Vlad. I feel better now. Yes, everything you said is true, and we will have a man up front the comrades like. That's extremely important. I like the guy, it's just that he seems such a cream puff. Anyway, no matter how many spies we have, nor how many soldiers and sailors and airmen, in the end it is the comrades around the world who can stop the capitalists from attacking us as a united front. As long as we have one side or the other of the imperialist camp when war breaks out, we will win, if we have the industrial base by that time equivalent to any one of these two emerging camps. Now I know what to say to him. The boss walked to the side of his main desk and hit that familiar button. Poskrebyshev, get Dimitrov back in here. Yes, sir. Poor George Dimitrov almost had a heart attack when several Chekists tackled him at the gate before he could get in the car taking him back to his hotel. But they soon had him back upstairs. If somewhat flustered and irritated, he was shown in. Comrade Dimitrov, announced Poskrebyshev. Sorry if they roughed you up, George I just wanted to go over one important thing with you. I know you have done great work in Germany, Bulgaria and for the Comintern, but I want you to start thinking in broad historical terms. Our North American comrades have placed a man at the head of their party, William Z. Foster, who thinks the way we here in the Politburo do. Meaning in broad historical strokes actually materialized, as he sweeps one mass of workers in one critical industry after another into the right kind of unionization. Their party then recruits the best and brightest in this emerging mass movement. We need to be doing similar things internationally via the Comintern. For example, we have these Nazi Summer Olympics coming up next year. Why not have the Comintern organize an alternative socialist international Olympics in Spain somewhere? We have been in the League of Nations, for what, 2 years now, and all that pile of shit is a cabal of fascist nations and fascist-enabling nations. Italy is attacking North Africa and Ethiopia. They are trying to find a place to put their unemployed workers and poverty-stricken farmers without making any changes to ruling class ownership of that sorry fucked-up country. The Brits own the League of Nations and do pretty much what they like there, which right now is to bend over backwards to urge Hitler to attack us. The only important capitalist country not actively attacking us there is the United States, and that is only because they had the good sense not to get involved with all that human garbage. Max Litvinov does the best he can, but he needs help too. The Comintern should use our mass organizations to begin demanding the League do the things that Litvinov is demanding. Like standing up to Mussolini and Hitler. Anyway, the point is to try and sweep natural opponents of fascism into different kinds of mass manifestations. That's it, George. Any questions? Yes, Comrade Stalin. Do you think this time I can go back to my hotel without getting the shit beat out of me? Then he laughed. As did Stalin and Molotov. Dimitrov was on his way. Stalin would have placed his arm around him, but Stalin was too short, so he simply walked Dimitrov into the foyer where the Chekists who brought him were awaiting their own fate. Boys, you did good. Comrade Dimitrov agrees, do you not? Of course, comrades, and I appreciate your devotion to service to the chief of our international working class movement. Now, boys, do you think you can get him back to his hotel without beating the shit out of him? Just a light beating, boss. The sergeant joked. Stalin frowned, and that was the end of the jesting, and they were on their way as the boss said. Go. General Tukhachevsky at George V Funeral, London, 1936. Thank you for this complete report on our prima donna. I don't need this right now, but we're going to have to deal with it. The boss walked to his friend Lavrenti Beria with good hand extended. They were in Stalin's Staraya Street office complex, a building where they both worked. The subject, the Red Army's most famous officer. Beria was the party boss for Georgia but had been increasingly called to Moscow by the boss to assist in Cheka national operations. In another 3 years he would make a permanent transfer to take over all Cheka operations in the USSR and abroad. He started out as a Bonapartist. Only that cocksucker Trotsky would have hired him and pushed him forward. Then he was a communist, and now he is an ultra-left communist or Trotskyite undercover, commented Beria. I wouldn't care about all that if he would keep his mouth shut. I told him in no uncertain terms to do exactly that before I sent him to the funeral of that piece of shit king in London. King George V died January 20th, 1936, but it obviously didn't do any good. You know the problem, Lavrenti. If the Nazis get the idea we are going after them no matter what, then they may well fall for the Baldwin plot to construct a London-Berlin-Rome axis. Tukhachevsky is effectively a provocateur with all those bullshit speeches abroad, about how we are going to wrap the Nazi pig snout so well it will never dare stick its nose into our socialist garden, blah blah, bullshit. He wants to fight them right now, and I certainly do not. Before a week had gone by, the Anglo-American forces would join in against us, and then the Japs and the Frogs. We will have to deal with him eventually. The real problem is he has a base of support in the Politburo, and they won't replace him unless he presents a clear and present danger. He would not have ignored everything I told him before he left unless he was conspiring with others, certainly in the army, and probably in the Politburo too. He may well plan on using his ultraleft attack Nazism talk to build a base of support in the army and the party for a Bonapartist coup somewhere down the road. That is what he has always been, a Bonapartist. Even though he denies it now. I want you to get ready to handle this. We will need irrefutable proof. Remember, we cannot survive without Rapallo intact in the West. Lenin knew it and set it up this way. I won't let this aristocrat cocksucker Tukhachevsky, or anyone else for that matter, negate this arrangement. Furthermore, my friend, Tukhachevsky already has a base of support in the officer corps. This is mainly true out here in the West, but his influence runs throughout the Red Army. The worst part of that is he is resisting the reorganization of the military-industrial complex along the lines I have proposed as our general line in the air and on the ground in terms of the land tank and the flying tank we have to have when the Second World War starts. I am not sure why, but I think it has to do with the differences in how deep battle is to be implemented among our officers, even in the Frunze Academy. It may be simply because I support the land tank-air tank approach, that he opposes it. There are always plenty of malcontents with this deep battle strategy who will listen to this kind of talk. His idea of building a massive heavy bomber fleet would mean we would not have the money to build the Sturmovik fighter bombers, which are far more important for the kind of war we can fight. His call to build 100,000 tanks is ridiculous. We can't build that many Ford Model A's yet. If we even tried, we would be bankrupt in a year or two. At any rate, I know he was conspiring with Zinoviev, and so probably others too. Can you handle this when the time comes? Yes. How much time do I have? Given the necessity of getting unanimous Politburo consent, as much as you need. Given the condition of Europe now, perhaps 2 or 3 years. As you can see in the report, we have total penetration on Czechoslovak President Benes. That's where we will get the proof. I'll keep you informed. You're ready to pick them up whenever? Of course. I don't want the Chaika involved at all. That idiot Yagoda is on his way out, and I'm not sure his replacement is any more reliable. Besides, the Lubyanka leaks like a sieve as far as the party is concerned. Use your own network, SMRSH, and do keep me informed step by step as the intelligence accumulates. Is there anything else, Koba? Yes. One more thing. Death of a King, Wallace Simpson Stalin, and Beria, March 1936. Lavrenti, what I am about to tell you is known only to me and 2 men in Red Army intelligence. When we were in China in force, Red Army G2, GRU, recruited a number of English-speaking agents. One of them is an American woman named Wallace Simpson. She came to us via a North American communist, Anna Louise Strong, while a high-class prostitute in Shanghai. Actually, Lav, as I recall, she has as many names as we do, but in her case it is because she has had so many lovers and husbands. At any rate, the latest man in her career is the Prince of Wales. The new king. Yes. This piece of shit is going to be coronet by May of next year, 1937, now that the funeral of the old king is completed. There will be 40,000 invited, so it will take a while to put it together. That gives us a little time. The problem is this guy is an outright Nazi. A personal friend of Himmler and Hitler, and he acts as a German agent in his own country. This makes this particular royal reactionary unacceptable to us. This is exactly what we do not want. British Prime Minister Baldwin is engineering a plot against us of his own, and the class behind him currently does not want to go to war with us with Hitler at its head. I don't want them to change their mind because of this new cocksucker on the throne. So, what is the answer? In this case, because we have Prince David's, Edward Vyatha's, girlfriend on our payroll, it seems to me we should be able to get him to abdicate, hopefully before his coronation. Fortunately, the Baldwin clique hates him, and I want you to run her in such a way as to make her multiple previous marriages an unacceptability issue over which Baldwin will force this new king to do that. How exactly would this be done? The prince is all fucked up sexually just like all the Brit aristocrats and completely subject to fetish manipulation. This is how she hooked him. He will give up the throne rather than his daily sexual excesses, which at any rate could not be easily satisfied elsewhere for a whole bunch of reasons. Am I amusing you? I'm laughing because I never dreamed such a thing was going on and probably wouldn't have believed it if you hadn't told me. Yes, I can get her to continue to take him down the fetish road to Roman decadence, if everything checks out in the file. Koba, as usual you caught me by surprise with this, but I don't need to know who they are, but I do need to know if there are other army intel agents in England that the Chaika does not know about. This will be an important consideration in planning. Yes. But I think we should run her as an individual agent with a specialized control. Of course, and G2 will know about the others so we won't step on any toes. This is the only copy in existence of her file. Take it with you and brief yourself and then link up with the GRU generals. I want it back and not copied. Lav, I know you can do this and you are the only one I trust to take over the project. That asshole Yagoda I have already blocked from working with any of our networks in West Europe, and I certainly would not want him, or the Chaika under his leadership, or anyone else's for that matter, to know anything about this. Thank you, Lav. And as an historical note, the king did abdicate December 11, 1936. 4. Insight into what Wallace Simpson confronted in Shanghai in her earlier days. I recommend the 2005 movie The White Countess, Ralph Fiennes and Natasha Richardson. British collaboration with fascism in the decade 1926 to 1936. The British ruling class was as deeply involved in plotting to overthrow the Soviet government as it was possible to be. By 1936 this led to outright support for fascism in its various forms, although in ways more subtle than sending troops. Its new blatant pro-fascist foreign policy began in Spain. After 1936, British and French ruling oligarchs would continue to try and get the Germans to take the point right up and until they were either overcome, as the French were in 1940, or until after Hitler had first taken them to the mat, as he did with the UK, also in 1940. The policy in short was to attack the USSR once the Brit and French ruling cap families could get Germany to take the point. The strategy of the British ruling Conservative, Tory, party was to manipulate events so as to come up with a London-Berlin-Rome axis. What had thrown PM Stanley Baldwin and his successor Neville Chamberlain a curve was the unexpected ascent of Hitler to power in January 1933. The reason this ascent of one king from another had thrown them into a tizzy was because the minority section of the British ruling class was cravenly pro-Nazi, and led by this new King Edward VIII Star. In his short pre-coronation time on the throne, this new king, who would last less than 1 year, had threatened Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in March of 1936 with abdication should Baldwin go to war against Germany for any reason. But at that critical moment, because Hitler had just militarily seized the Alsace-Lorraine region on the French border, Baldwin represented the majority section of the ruling cap families, and they did not want to go to war with Russia with Hitler at the head of Germany. Furthermore, they had no use for the new king's idea of restoring total monarchy as in the years prior to the coming of Cromwell. And Cromwell was their greatest, most terrifying class memory. Later, as the Duke of Windsor, at the outset of World War II in 1940, David, formerly the Prince of Wales and formerly abdicated King Edward, would perform the ultimate treason in providing Hitler with all of the British and French defensive plans just in time for the Germans to break through by circumventing the Maginot Line and striking through the weakest front of French defenses. At the time, the traitor Duke was on the British General Staff in Paris, preparing the joint defense of France from Nazi invasion. Britain never had a greater traitor than this Windsor king. The Duke's brother, George VI, an always stupid king of England, sent one of our agents, Anthony Blunt, then number 4 in what MI6 called the Ring of Five, as the Crown would later be forced to admit under Margaret Thatcher, to search for and destroy his brother David's, now Duke of Windsor, 1930s and 1940s letters to the Nazis, the sitting King George VI believed to be in the possession of Windsor relatives in Germany. Worried that the Windsor treason might still be bad enough in the public mind to damn the entire royal family, we have seen today's masters of propaganda try and build sympathy for the moron George VI in the recent hit movie The King's Speech with Colin Firth, Geoffrey Rush and Helena Bonham Carter, of the famous Bonham Carter political family, about this stuttering fool. At any rate, Blunt went right into Germany following the American and British troops as they entered Nazi Germany. Whatever he found was taken directly to King George VI of England and, of course, Joseph Stalin. I assume this would have made Stalin laugh his ass off. Of course, Stalin had known about David and his Nazi plotting for many years, as you have. However, it was only the British ruler's allergy to Cromwell and the English Revolution of 1640 to 1680, see Chapter 9 above, that stopped an immediate joint attack on the USSR by Britain, France and Italy with Germany in the lead. When one sets aside what was in their minds the ideological nonsense, it was clear to Baldwin and the great majority of Britain's wealthiest families that Hitler was another Cromwell, and that they could not yet stomach. After all, Cromwell had almost finished them off, abolishing the monarchy and the House of Lords. Alexander Orloff kept Stalin apprised of the machinations of Baldwin's cabinet and Edward's rancid court via his spies Philby, Burgess, Maclean, Blunt and Cairncross. Meanwhile, in Spain, the billionaire boss of criminal bosses and Spanish fascist chieftain Juan March was sufficiently encouraged by Britain's de facto collaboration with Hitler over the Alsace-Lorraine. He authorized armed revolt and provided all of the finance for Spanish fascism and gave the go-ahead for a Spanish fascist army officers' uprising once again. The fascist revolt began in July 17, 1936. However, Stalin, because of his spies, had anticipated this development and had dispatched Orlov to Spain in March of 1936 to prepare the way for indirect intervention when the time came. This because the Chekists in charge of Iberia had kept Stalin apprised of the secret fascist conspiracy to overthrow the moderate bourgeois Madrid regime. He knew it was only a matter of time until the plot was brought to fruition. Stalin realized it was important to put up some resistance to the fascists in Spain for a variety of reasons, but he could not, officially, send the Red Army. He would have to rely on Orlov's organizing partisan and perhaps regular warfare along the lines of what he had done for Stalin in Russia's Civil War, as we have already reviewed. Orlov left behind a working network of agents, and Stalin followed up with unofficial, in fact, disguised, Soviet pilots and tank crews and then infantry. The necessary supply of infantry pumped in the form of international volunteers. These became the international brigades. When the fascist conspirators succeeded in moving their army from North Africa to the peninsula, Stalin's men were not far behind. Stalin knew the delicate nature of the work in Spain. Accordingly, he pulled Orlov out of his British and other West European responsibilities and gave him sole command of Soviet operations in Spain in August 1936. Tire meets asphalt, August 1936. So, by the time Juan March gave the order, July 17, to overthrow the Republican government in Madrid, Stalin had his organization in place in Spain, barely, July 30, 1936. And within weeks, international volunteers began to show up along with Soviet troops and weapons. For them and for us, as the rubber met the asphalt, as they say, it would be a chance to do a little ass-kicking. Juan March was born on October 4, 1880 and died on the 10th of March 1962. He was a Spanish gangster and legal businessman who financed the fascist side in the Spanish Civil War. Francisco Franco. Juan March became the wealthiest man in Spain and the sixth richest man in the world. The March family is among the richest in the world, reported to be worth over $150 billion. Santa Margalita on the island of Santa Margalita, Majorca, North Africa. Smuggled tobacco. World War I. Allied Central Powers. German U-boats. His power and influence increased under different Spanish governments during the reign of King Alfonso XIII. Banca March. In 1930, the monarchy was replaced by the Second Spanish Republic. March lost his influence, and was convicted and imprisoned for his illegal dealings. He paid to escape from prison and fled to Gibraltar. There his influence with the Gibraltar British government protected him against extradition. In 1936, March financed the war against the Republic. He arranged Franco's flight from the extradition Canary Islands to Spanish Morocco. He brought the colonial troops there into the rebellion and personally financed the Italian airlift of those troops to southern Spain. In 1939, with the fascist victory, March regained all his former influence. He was the most favored capitalist of the Franco regime. During World War II, the Allies employed him to keep Spain from joining the Axis. Franco regime Allies Axis in 1941. According to recently declassified documents, the British government gave him US $10,000,000 with which to bribe the top Spanish generals. In 1944, March became a supporter of the claim of US Don Juan de Borbón, who had turned pro-Allies to the Spanish throne. He owned newspapers devoted to Franco. In 1945, he was the seventh richest man in the world. In 1955, he established the Juan March Foundation. It still supports fascism in Spain. Juan March was married to Leonor Cervera, 1887 to 1957. They had two children, Juan March Cervera, Palma de Mallorca, 1906, Madrid, 1973, and Bartolomé March, Palma de Mallorca, 1917, Paris, 1998. Juan's son Bartolomé March amassed one of the greatest 20th century art collections. At a young age, he started buying books and manuscripts. Later, he collected 18th century French furniture and Baroque Impressionist, Impressionist modern, and contemporary art, including works of modern Murillo Goya, Velázquez Picasso, Monet Van Gogh, Miro Kandinsky Brancusi, Leger, Dali, Fontana, Rothko, Klein, Francis Bacon, Fontana, Rothko, Klein, Bacon, and many others. The collection is reported to be worth over $1 billion USD. Gestad USD. The March family are still super rich today. The family continues as one of the richest families in Spain. They live between Madrid, Majorca, and Gstaad. The Casa March, an imposing villa overlooking Cala Rajada and Majorca. Inside snapshot. Spain and Stalin's decision, August 2, 1936. On a broiling Moscow summer day in early August 2, 1936, Joseph Stalin, in military uniform, was pacing in front of the door leading to the foyer of his Staraya Street office, as was his custom in dress and conduct, awaiting the arrival of his European spy boss, the Chekist codenamed Alexander M. Orlov, Lev Feldbin. His secretary, Alexander N. Poskrebyshev, announced the arrival of Stalin's closest associate and prime minister, fellow Politburo member Vyacheslav, Vlad, Molotov, and seconds later, Orlov. Molotov examined the map of Spain, someone from Stalin's secretariat had set up in the center of the room, minutes earlier. Stalin bear-hugged the entering NKVD general. "Thank goodness you're back, Leviticus. Koba. It's always wonderful to see you again. You too, Vlad. We have as much time today as you wish. Now go ahead and brief me on Spain." Stalin continued to stand as Orlov went to the map and began as follows. "Following the instructions you gave me, I proceeded under alias to Barcelona and then visited our party leaders in each of the cities you specified. Along the way I deposited our Spanish-speaking intelligence officers and a small staff in each of these locales. Of course, we have shortwave contact with all of them. We are now in a position to do whatever we may be ordered to do next. As for the situation in general, it's a mixed bag. On the positive side, the Republican government controls the center and most populated portion of the country. It has an excellent armored force, good aircraft, and an outstanding navy. Furthermore, the working class is uniformly anti-fascist and totally committed to volunteer labor to the degree necessary to man the war industries. Premier among these industries is the Hispano-Suiza industrial complex. On the negative side, the problem area is already clear. At least to me. And that is even normal military education is unavailable to what will have to be a new generation of army officers, since almost all of those field grade and above, major and above in US parlance, ed., are fascist traitors and have now to be replaced. Not that this is the worst of it. The anarchists, syndicalists, Trotskyite, and other ultra-left Marxist nutballs are a far more serious problem because they have fractionated portions of the working class, in those areas where they have an apparatus. Our own party is still quite small, but that will change, I suspect, if we intervene along the lines you indicated you were considering a few months ago. On the other hand, it may be too late for us to turn the tide with our volunteer forces, although I think it is now a matter of timing. If we intervene quickly, we may be able to save the Republicans, at least for the moment. Our prestige and that of our correspondent party will increase enormously. In short, if the Republicans lose, it will be because of the ultra-left crackpot ideas which have infected the army. By which I mean all this bullshit about soldiers' committees, direct election, and worst of all, direct recall of officers and NCOs. As usual, the ultra-left has learned nothing from our experience in our Civil War. My recommendation is that we force the imposition of clarity on the left. They must be made to accept the advances in the organization of the people as a whole in the form of their own revolutionary, if not red, army. However, inevitably, we will have to convince the Republican leaders to liquidate the entire ultra-left, before it can completely infect and thereby totally destroy the Republican resistance. Or we will have to do it ourselves. Normally used to cover maps for tracing, the old Bolsheviks had gotten used to using transparent paper to plan battle tactics. Orlov pulled down on a transparent paper rolled tight above the map of Spain, and drew a line with a red crayon, and drew several black crayon circles. Now on the map, this is what the current disposition of forces of both the Republicans and the fascist order of battle looks like. These are the danger points. A seizure of Madrid could be the checkmate in 4 moves. That would end this war before it really gets started. To prevent this collapse from occurring and to prepare a decent war plan for 1937, we would have to do, at the minimum, the following. Orlov then handed one copy of his eyes only final report, the only copy, to Stalin directly, who took it to his desk and placed squarely in front of the chair he would eventually assume when resuming desk work. As the fundamental decisions are yours and the Politburo's, I want to raise the question of whether it is worth it to invest the time and treasure necessary to secure this rather primitive country's left government. I mean, even if they win, they will require huge amounts of foreign assistance or investment, however you want to look at it, and whether this is worth it when we are struggling to prepare for the inevitable coming world war here at home, should be, I think, the central question. Finally, I don't think Yagoda is up to this. I have had nothing but trouble with him over our European operations, and he is completely out of his depth. It is bad enough we have to keep him out of the UK altogether. In Spain we can't afford one fuck up. Now Koba, I'm ready to answer specific questions. First, Lev, let me thank you for your wonderful work. You have always made me proud, and while I have made many mistakes over the years, appointing you chief of European intelligence was certainly not one of them. Quite the opposite. While you were taking care of business so brilliantly in Spain, I have been confronting a rapidly escalating international situation that has required the kinds of critical decisions you refer to, and I'll bring you up to speed. As you know, Baldwin gave Hitler Alsace-Lorraine in March. That was their signal to Germany that England did not oppose their territorial readjustment ideas, which of course includes Hitler's long-promised attack on us. It may be that the civil war in Spain is going to be the critical test to the Germans as to whether they are really ready for war with us. In short, we have to bloody their nose in Spain for our own good. There is the additional fact the Spanish can pay for our assistance. They have perhaps 1,000 tons of gold in their treasury we could take as equity against the cost of armaments, and which we could use. However, dialectically, it is definitely a great risk for us to get involved in Spain. You can be sure that the ruling oligarchy of capitalists in England and France will try and terrify their own bourgeoisie, especially their petty bourgeoisie, with the specter of a Red Army invasion of Spain. They want to join with Hitler and Mussolini for a combined attack on us. As you know, it is only the Brits' desire to remove Hitler and put in a government in Berlin more amenable to their anti-Cromwellian prejudices which has so far delayed the Baldwin plot for a London-Berlin-Rome axis against us. On the one hand, I need and must have combat specifications on reliability, firepower, armor, speed, and most importantly producibility, for our new main battle tanks. And we need all kinds of specs for our aircraft. This mess in Spain gives us the objective conditions for such combat testing. On the other hand, as I just explained, we certainly cannot send the Red Army, nor the Red Navy. But we can send entire necessary military units in civilian clothes and then put them into Republican uniforms for their tank force and air force. What we can do openly is to send international volunteers. The first contingent of these will be primarily our best Soviet youth, but the international force should emphasize the non-communist anti-fascist youth from the major capitalist countries that will have gone to Spain to fight fascism. We are to be seen as a good friend and partner in the spirit of the United Front Against Fascism doctrine adopted last year by the Comintern Congress. Stalin's reference was to the 7th Comintern Congress held in 1935. I can and will send our modern tanks and warplanes and the crews to man them, but again they will have Republican markings and their drivers, crews, and pilots will wear Republican uniforms. As you send back data on machinery performance, I will see that we update the engineers in the design institutes and get the changes and modifications performed super quickly. Oh yes, you Leviticus. You're taking over in Spain. I will provide you with a blank check on checkists. You should pick the staff you want while you are here to take with you and appoint permanent liaison officers to secure a continuing flow of men and material from the Soviet Union to the Spanish Republic. I will see to it that they get 100% support here. It's up to you to see that they are properly deployed in the war zone. This should be child's play for you, as it is a replay of what we did in the Civil War, together, Lev, and especially as you disrupted the Polish capitalist feudalist armies in 1920. Finally, the Spanish have the money to pay for our support, so I expect them to use it. If they did not, we would of course pay the bill. But since they do have it, and as you properly point out, we are in a life and death struggle to industrialize before the next worldwide assault of the capitalists against us, they should use it. This money is in the form of hundreds of tons of gold and silver, the remnants of their rape of the New World. The day will come when I will tell them through Ambassador Rosenthal to send that gold here for safekeeping and for security against the cost of our military support. But you have to take charge of that personally, Lev. As for Yagoda, I will replace him. Before you go to get things together, I want you to come with me to the Kremlin. I have a visiting party delegation from the United States. I want you to meet them. We'll take advantage of the opportunity to talk and grab a bite to eat along the way. The boss was always thinking several steps ahead. Juan March as Meyer Lansky and Bigard. As we have seen, Spain had its own boss of the illegal capitalist element in the equation, and his name was Juan March. The Spanish equivalent of Meyer Lansky and Bigard, March was truthfully referred to as a gangster and a pirate. He was in fact, and most importantly, the Spanish top organized crime boss. Furthermore, he had selected General Francisco Franco early on as the comer he was going to back. He wanted someone competent to overthrow the silly government in Madrid. Francisco Franco. Franco was almost a dwarf in stature, but he had proven his military competence in Africa and his intelligence as chief of the Army War College. Most importantly, he was a dyed-in-the-wool fascist of the monarchist persuasion. Carlos Prieto once told me, October 1962, in Mexico City well before Franco's death, the most fascinating thing to him about Franco is that Franco actually believes he is inferior to the monarchs as are all common people. I pass it on to you for what it's worth. See my book The Buccaneer for more about Carlos Prieto, then one of Mexico's leading playwrights, communists, and red intelligence agents. Type Ayari Prieto stock, Tudor Jones, into your browser for more about this hero of our cause. I recall the most interesting thing about Franco to me when I had visited Spain in April 1961, while just beginning in the U.S. military intelligence service, was that Franco was still alive and running the show. March and Franco together forever. Anyway, March's price? Total control of Spain's foreign commerce. In the end, Juan March would succeed by gaining legal complete control of foreign commerce from Franco's insurgent government. Most importantly, March made billions initially in the sale of the ores of Rio Tinto, and those of Asturias, and the Basque provinces to Nazi Germany. March would pay his way all right, by paying all of Franco's costs in the build-up to fascist rebellion. Wherever and whenever Franco needed cash and credit, March was there with that cash and credit in small, medium and huge quantities as the right-wing fascist officers' conspiracy took on new life. Nor were his banks just in fascist countries but in England as well, where Baldwin and Chamberlain were well aware of what was going on and turned the other eye. Cynics might imply non-accidental causes to General José Sanjurjo's crashing on takeoff from nearby Lisbon, Portugal, in an overloaded airplane the night the rebellion began in Spain. One thing is for sure, and that is with the passing of the old general, who had before fucked up an attempt to overthrow the Republican government, the revolt had to find a leader. March was more than ready to back the ploy of his favorite general, the rather dwarfish Franco, who at the moment was stranded in Spanish Morocco, unable to cross into Spain as the Spanish Navy was in the hands of the Republicans. March had earlier hired a plane in London to go and get Franco, languishing in the Canary Islands, and take him to Morocco. March paid the freight all the way. He then financed Franco's emissary to Mussolini, charged with buying 12 planes to help ferry fascist troops from Morocco to Spain. March deposited $1.2 billion in gold in an Italian bank at that time. The real purpose was to pay the cost and especially the bribes to the Mussolini gang for 150,000 Italian troops. March had his hand everywhere where Franco was going to need it, and this gave Franco the edge when he needed it most. Even though it was Hitler who first succumbed to Franco's entreaties for help, thanks to March's intervention with his high-ranking Nazi colleagues, sending 20 Ju-52 transport planes to lift his North African army into peninsular Spain, and overall sent the most important help to him from the fascist bloc of countries, sending the German fleet and hundreds of fighter planes to uncover the loading and unloading of Franco's North African troops. It was the Italian mafia March had to please to get them and Mussolini involved. He did so with his transfer of such large quantities of money to Italy and its mafioso bankers. Once again, speaking historically, the gangster element of the capitalist class had saved their class brothers from themselves. March was instituting a fascist dictatorship in his Spanish mafia image. In the event, it was Hitler's air and sea power that lifted most of Franco's foreign legionnaires and Spanish Gurkhas, called Moors, to Spain. These were the troops the fascists used under Franco to massacre Badajoz, and then the manpower for their march toward Madrid. It was Mussolini's soon thereafter arriving troops that gave the final impetus to the fascist Franco's drive on Madrid. Kirov matter concluded in August of 1936. While Stalin and Orlov were perfecting their Spanish strategy, Zinoviev and Kamenev met the fate of history. Both had been brought to trial in June, along with several others, for conspiring with Trotsky and other foreign powers for 1. The murder of Sergei Kirov, and 2. Plotting against the Soviet Union. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. As I say, they had been charged with inspiring and organizing the assassination of Sergei Kirov in 1934. Both these two had publicly opposed the party general line on collectivization and industrialization. Zinoviev and then Kamenev were shot following their confessions and conviction. On top of the evidence supporting the government's charges, their record as traitors on the eve of October was held against them in fact if not in law. Meanwhile, the war is off and running. During July and August 1936, Hitler's Ju-52 transports made 461 flights transferring 7,350 troops from Spanish Morocco to neighboring Spain. Into Spain in September, 324 more Nazi flights lifted 5,455 more troops. The rest of Franco's fascist troops came from North Africa on German warships protected by hundreds of German fighters. Rebel generals in Spain began coming over to Franco, bringing some 120,000 more Spanish troops with them. Hitler would send 50,000 German troops to help Franco, Mussolini 150,000 Italian troops. Dr. Salazar, the fascist dictator of Portugal, sent 20,000 troops to help Franco. In terms of war material, the fascist bloc, Germany, Italy, Portugal, sent the Spanish fascist army 1,150 tanks and other armored vehicles, 1,650 warplanes and 2,700 artillery pieces. Our side immediately began the shipping of very large quantities of war material and troops to the Spanish Republic. This was not an easy task. Our only military naval support for Spain was in the Black Sea. So, unarmed freighters had to carry all this to Republican ports at Barcelona and Valencia. Nazi and Italian warships and planes constantly watched this activity, waiting for a chance to attack, which would have to be in the unloading process unless these two aggressor nations were ready for war with the Red Army, which they were not. Orlov was commanding the Soviet effort on the ground, as we have seen. Also, incoming top troubleshooters included General Jan Karlovich Berzin, Chief of Red Army G2 Intelligence, as direct official liaison and chief military advisor to the Spanish Army, and V.A. Antonov, who led the seizure of the Winter Palace in Petrograd, as consul general in Barcelona. Rosenthal went to Madrid as official ambassador. The first left boots on the ground to arrive were 2,000 plus Soviet volunteers in September 1936. Then in October and over the following several months, some 60,000 foreign volunteers arrived to form international battalions grouped into international brigades, which were then used to stiffen the ranks of the loyal Republican Army units. The North Americans, for example, formed several battalions, the most famous of which were the Abraham Lincoln Battalion and the George Washington Battalion of the 15th International Brigade, most of whom arrived in February 1937 and played a key part in the breaking of the fascist siege of Madrid. In the process, the George Washington Battalion was largely wiped out, and the U.S. fighters were consolidated into the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. In everyday talk, the North Americans became known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. On October 12, 1936, the first Soviet equipment reached Spain. Arrived. These volunteers and these Soviet planes, tanks, artillery and small arms saved Madrid when the battle began there nearly a month later. And by that time, thousands of European volunteers were arriving to stiffen the ranks of the Republican Army. Stalin initially sent Spain 648 warplanes, 407 tanks including 60 armored cars, 1,186 artillery pieces, 20,486 machine guns, 498,000 rifles. To instruct and use these weapons, Stalin sent 2,065 specialist commanders, including 772 pilots, 351 tank commanders, 100 artillerymen, 222 general advisors, and 204 interpreters. Over the next 3 years, the Soviets would send many more tanks, planes, and small arms. As well, Stalin sent a huge amount of food, fuel, lubricants, medicine, medical personnel. Not to mention the replacement shells, bullets, and bombs, as stocks were used up on a regular basis during combat. Our heroes saved Madrid at a high cost. Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Of the 60,000 volunteers we sent to Spain, we lost at least half of them, and the majority of that loss occurred during the initial phases of the battle for Madrid, November 7 to 23, 1936. Then the fighting for Madrid went over to the siege of Madrid, which continued until May of 1937. In April and May of 1937, the international brigades led the Spanish army in an assault against the fascists and their Italian allies on the ground, another 150,000 men, and the Germans in the air. The Soviet Air Corps destroyed the advance guard of German aircraft and negated their air assault. All in all, in the fighting for Madrid, we lost at least 20,000 men. Of the 60,000 internationalists, there were at least 3,600 U.S. males. Among the international brigades, there were also 80 women in the consolidated U.S. unit named the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, including Marion Merriman, the wife of U.S. Communist Major Robert Merriman, the Abraham Lincoln Battalion's first combat commander. It was Ernest Hemingway's friend Merriman who was the model for Hemingway's hero Robert Jordan in the novel For Whom the Bell Tolls. Today there is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives at New York University, where one can do research, and which is available online at http://www.alba-valby.org. Some of the U.S. fighters got there on their own in time to fight in the Battle for Madrid, which began November 7, 1936. The bulk arrived in February of 1937. As I say, many U.S. women also went to Spain. At least 80 went, not as soldiers but as nurses, secretaries, ambulance drivers, and truck drivers. See the movie Into the Fire, American Women in the Spanish Civil War, 2002, by filmmaker Julia Newman. 58 minutes, Netflix. These people put their lives on the line, where only their mouths had been. This included a black nurse who, along with nearly 100 black male soldiers, made this battalion the first all-racially and sexually integrated U.S. combat unit in U.S. history. Assisting the international fighters and the Spanish fighters were not only Spanish and other doctors from many nations but U.S. doctors and the Canadian Dr. Norman Bethune. Bethune invented the modern method of taking blood transfusion equipment to the battlefield rather than losing patients, who first had to be transported to hospitals in the rear over what were often treacherous roads, unhealthy even for normal persons to traverse. Footage and stills of Bethune are shown in the Julia Newman film above. Bethune went on to China to assist the Chinese communists, where sometimes he was the only medical doctor in the Chinese Red Army forces. In China he is today a household word but blacked out by the capitalist press in North America, so here hardly anyone has ever heard of him, even in his own country. Steve Nelson came to world attention in Spain, including drawing the attention of Stalin and Beria, as the top political officer and then as the battalion's commander. Nelson was perhaps the best commander the battalion ever had. He went on to run Beria's penetration of the Manhattan Project and later as a chief of the Quissa campaign against the fascists, part-time homosexual, full-time alcoholic, from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy. Rare footage of Steve Nelson can be seen in the movie The Good Fight available on Netflix, as are 2 other Spanish Civil War documentaries. No people deserve more respect from us 2013 Bolsheviks than those who went to Spain. I met Steve when I was in the Quissa Portland Youth Club in 1963 to 1964 as I recount in The Buccaneer. Next generation Red Army officers in Spanish Civil War in 1937. As the Spanish War unfolded, Stalin began the purge and reorganization of both the Red Army and its supporting military-industrial complex. Spain turned out to be the most important training ground for the new Red Army officer corps, including the elite Marshal's Council and producing 40 new generals from the upcoming field-grade officers. Many future high-ranking officers fought in Spain as lieutenants and captains. As I say, 40 new generals, 1 to 4 stars, and rear admirals were promoted from this corps of blooded combat officers who had volunteered for Spain. Of those, some became critically acclaimed for their conduct during the coming Second World War, including R.Y. Malinovsky, who became a marshal and commissar for defense for the USSR. K.A. Meretskov became a marshal and chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. G.I. Kulikov became a marshal and deputy commissar for defense of the USSR. N.G. Kuznetsov became a fleet admiral, naval equivalent to an army marshal, and commissar for the Red Navy and a member of the Stavka High Command. Throughout the entire war, our Secret Service heroes did their portion. Kim Philby. Kim Philby looked more Windsor than the Windsors. Average 2 tall in height, cool and clear blue eyes, blonde hair, perfectly slim and fit physically, ladies' man, proper pedigree, perfect manners, proper educational background from beginning to end and high marks to go with it. Now he was in Saragossa at the Maria Isabel, the finest hotel in that city in 1937. Philby had been sending reports from Burgos since February of 1937 and by May, thanks to his father and Orlov, had been made the Times official correspondent attached to the fascist Falangist Party's forces now unified under General Francisco Franco. His editors turned out to be thrilled as he provided the Times, and its editors, the prestige which had evaded them for some time, for balanced and fair coverage of the continental, fascist right. In other words, a fascist propagandist a la Fox News. Philby had the ability to write reports that made Spanish fascism seem enlightened, and more importantly invincible, so that it was the better part of valor, no matter what political position a Tory happened to take on the matter of fascism in general, to see the wisdom in supporting this particular fascist, which is to say General Francisco Franco. Even the Tory anti-Nazi maverick Winston Churchill found Philby objective, convincing, and probably right. Philby's dispatches always mentioned Franco's concern for common people, his perfect credit rating, and the normalcy of life in Falangist controlled parts of Spain, not to mention the always perfect maintenance of law and order. In 1937, Philby had insisted that only the Chayka's in-country Iberian chief work with him, to provide him with what he needed to know, and in turn so he could provide what Chayka hitmen needed to know to carry out sabotage and killing missions. Later, after recruitment into MI6 in 1940, Philby was acting, as far as MI6 was concerned, as chief of his own recruited team of Spanish shooters, eliminating the need to use the double OS asterisk, and Philby was paying for it with a generous Chayka budget, although MI6 had no idea. Even so, his 1937-38 Lone Wolf track record in Spain and Portugal provided the cover for him to do the same thing on a larger scale when MI6 would send him back to Iberia as their agent. It was a freebie for London HQ, M** would appreciate, with so many tasks for the double OS to accomplish elsewhere. Ian Fleming, MI6 chief, is C, not M. Ian Fleming, a former MI6 agent, and scion of one of Britain's wealthiest families, and James Bond novels author, so indoctrinated everyone with his terminology I am using it but will explain where appropriate the real terminology. In this case OOOO stands for the real term, licensed, meaning licensed to kill. M was actually C, as you will see in the pre-Bond era, Graham Greene novel and movie Our Man in Havana, starring Alec Guinness. Smersh. On his own and completely without the Chayka's knowledge, originally provided by Orlov at Molotov's private direction, Beria's organization, nominally a special section of the Chayka, SMERSH, the Russian acronym for Smyrt Spionem, Death to Spies, later made famous by Ian Fleming as an archenemy of James Bond, not to be confused with Bond's fictional other enemy Spectre, had secreted a radio system in an invulnerable position, and in 1937 Philby would use it as necessary, which would be hardly at all. For Philby's job was not to provide intelligence to the Red Secret Service, but to build his own credentials for a mission still years away. Unless, of course, he should run across information that needed to be provided to Comrade Stalin immediately. Thus, the radio direct contact with the Kremlin was available. Cutting out Yezhov and all of Moscow Central, Philby routinely reported, beginning in 1937, while in Spain, directly to Orlov, and then with Orlov's 1938 reassignment, Philby reported to Beria and Molotov. Even directly to Stalin when exigent circumstances required it. See Molotov's autobiography. Molotov remembers. Philby needed a constant flow of accurate data about many things Moscow Central did not need to know he knew. This was provided to him on a regular basis by a Spanish librarian, controlled directly by Molotov, which is to say Stalin, with impeccable Spanish aristocratic, cousin, class credentials and absolutely without any left contacts whatsoever in her own culture. When Stalin wanted Kim to know certain highly sensitive background information, it was provided to her, and via Moscow rules she fed it to him when he appeared at her library. In turn, when he asked for specific information she transferred the request on her own radio, and if an answer were forthcoming Philby would pick it up at his next review of the daily Spanish press, which was available, on a daily basis, to hundreds of eager readers, of which, to spying eyes, he was only one more. Anita Boyer. This SMRSH agent survived and I met her years later, 1962, in Mexico City, via the good offices of KGB agent Anita Boyer. This agent has living family in Mexico and therefore I am not revealing her identity. Anita was the former wife of Canadian and Soviet spy Raymond Boyer, who was the first identified and self-confessed Soviet agent in Canada at the end of World War II. After Boyer she became the wife of U.S. oligarch Frederick Vanderbilt Fields. Anita was an extraordinarily beautiful woman and could have just about any man she wanted, as I can testify from personal experience. At any rate, divorced from Vanderbilt Fields she became in Mexico a prominent person in the film industry. And in May 1970, when Cuban, DGI, and Cheka, KGB, intelligence were often at odds, she provided access to the home of Carlos Prieto, to shake it down about me, on the first night I met her. This is another story in my autobiography. Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation. For those of you with more than a passing interest, Anita was always our agent, and Raymond and Vanderbilt Fields' Cheka controller. Take my word for it. Stalin takes direct command of Spain. As you can see, the situation in Spain was fraught with danger for the international working class movement in general, and the USSR in particular. A mistake of any kind, even a seemingly small one, could be disastrous, leading to world war. Worse, a world war with all the capped countries on one side and the USSR, the People's Republic of Mongolia and the Red Base areas in China, on the other. After the battle for Madrid stabilized successfully for the Republic, May 1937, Stalin, who had taken direct command of all Spanish operations of the Comintern and placed Orlov in direct command, on the ground, now began a purge of the Cheka's foreign operations with the aim of making it a more reliable tool. Stalin knew full well he could not continue to run each of the rapidly increasing number of Orlov's superagents, excepting the Magnificent Five and Richard Sorg, on a personal basis, and that meant the Cheka management of its foreign operations had to be brought up to speed. But could the managerial hardware of the Cheka be returned to the same high level it had exhibited under Felix Dzerzhinsky? The answer turned out to be yes, but it was a process rather than a happening, and it started like this. Inside Snapshot, April 1937. Thank you, Vlad, for filling in. Molotov automatically arose from the boss's chair and stood to the side waiting to hear the outcome of what had just gone before. Fucking asshole. I can't believe Kalinin was so drunk that he fell down and had to be removed from the stage. Can you imagine how that affected all those school teachers? I'm sure you put it straight. I did, but it took all morning. I am glad I went. Only the army is more important to us than these teachers who have the minds of our youth in their custody. Fortunately, the bullshit propaganda campaign turning me into a superhero worked to take their minds off of Kalinin, the president of the Soviet Union, and onto me. I got us past the debacle of that drunk on the stage, and as importantly, I got a real feel for their problems. They are a loyal and dedicated bunch. They need more money and we have to get it to them. Yes, sir. I'll get on it now. Any specific recommendations? A mountain of them. Poskrebyshev has the book. Molotov, this Kalinin thing cannot happen again. From now on, for the rest of his fucking presidency, he will be watched 24 hours a day. The first time he has a drink, he will be taken to the Lubyanka. I understand. The boss sitting at his desk grabbed a telephone to his right and punched a familiar button. Beria. Put the president in a hospital. Not a regular hospital. He will intimidate the doctors as soon as he sobers up and wants another bottle, and he will leave a place like that. Arrest him. Put him in a rehab and don't let him out until I say so. Keep me informed. Yes, Koba. Consider it done. The boss hung up. Now, what were you saying about what happened to Philby? He was detained with his code on tissue paper in his pocket at the Great Admiral Hotel in Cordoba, about 30 kilometers from the Seville front. He was able to eat it, or he would be dead by now. It was just an accident as far as we can determine. An overzealous Franco policeman brought him in, even though he had a right to be there, and had checked ahead of time at Seville with Franco's cops just to be sure. Anyway, he's out of pocket, until we can replace his code instructions. Burgess is on his way to Gibraltar now. They'll connect and eventually he'll be back online. In the meantime, he's laying low and doing his job for the Times. We still have our radio contact. But Koba, that's not all. Yezhov seems to think you want Philby to get close to Franco and kill him. What? I take it you did not authorize Philby assassinating Franco. Of course not. Yezhov told me that Philby should be instructed to get close to Franco and kill him. He said by your order. Stalin threw one of his rather regular fits. Where is that little cocksucker? At this precise moment he is in Leningrad. Vlad, cancel any orders he may have given to that effect and get that little fucking dwarf here fast, even if you have to arrest him. I cannot believe that bullshit talk we had about Philby and Franco could be interpreted that way. If he is that stupid, he has to go. If he is not stupid, then he is a traitor highly placed. What the fuck is going to happen to this country when I die? I can't believe it. How long would Philby last under torture? 30 minutes. He would probably have a heart attack and die before they started. Exactly. And how long before it comes to my doorstep? Franco assassinated by an irate Spanish worker is one thing, by me quite another. How long before they find out about Philby's communism? Fuck my eyes. What was the dwarf thinking? The boss, on second thought, relieved Molotov of this responsibility and reached for one of his telephones, punching the familiar intercom button. Beria, the time may have come. Arrest Yezhov. He is surrounded by armed guards. You know what to do, but bring him to my Kremlin office first. I want him ASAP. I have to talk to him myself. Then, if necessary. I am already prepared. Lavrenti. Just be sure he is unarmed when he comes to the Kremlin. Otherwise the boys will kill him. I want to talk to him first. Done. The boss hung up and turned to Molotov. You have done extremely well, Vlad. You always do extremely well. By far you are the most competent person I have ever known. Now, as you know, it's time for me to take over directly, meaning Philby's reports come straight to me through you. Until the Chaika foreign operations are reorganized, I want it out of the circuit. You can read Philby's messages, of course, but I would prefer, when possible, you do it here in front of me just to be sure there's no delay in any communication, by definition urgent, or I wouldn't be getting it instantly. And, of course, keep talking to him on the radio for us. Vlad, it's absolutely imperative that we move our top men up the ladder. War is at best just a few years away. I have to have a man next to M and whoever the British PM happens to be when that time comes. I want you to get him through Spain in one piece, and be sure he is safeguarded to the degree you can. He is going to have to be there for a while. After all, we don't know for sure how long this fucking mess in Spain is going to go on. But I want him there for as long a time as possible. You see, it is very likely that the Brit capitalists are going to end up with their long-desired London-Berlin-Rome axis, in which case the role of Philby as anti-Soviet anti-communist chief within MI6 will be absolutely critical. This is the only way we have at the moment anyway to build his prestige in British ruling circles. You know I don't care what it costs as long as you keep him as safe as possible, actively sending back journalistic pro-fascist dispatches to that idiot capitalist newspaper. When the time comes for Philby to go back to London, we will engineer his recruitment into MI6. History will take care of the rest. Beria is our best man for the Iberian Peninsula. Let me suggest that you handle Philby via him. No, Vlad, I'll handle Philby the way I say. Now, what about Sorg? Gloria von Furstenberg, Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler. This night, April 23, 1937, Kim had been invited to a very special private party by La Donna Gloria von Furstenberg, a courtesan desired by the fascists perverse, at her villa outside the Phalangist front headquarters city of Saragossa. Gloria's soirée was arranged this night for luminaries of the Nazi and Italian delegations to Franco's insurgent regime. She had told him she expected Nazi Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler to make a personal appearance, and urged him to attend. She considered she was doing Kim a favor, as a correspondent who could be counted upon to put the right spin on things, if and when Himmler's appearance in Spain should become noticed elsewhere by the foreign press, most of whom she considered to be de facto under the influence of Bolshevism. Kim had a KVD's background on Gloria. He knew she was originally a Mexican prostitute who had become quite successful with wealthy men before she was 15 years old, and now was quite wealthy herself, having acquired high status in international sexually decadent fascist circles. The song, Gloria, pretty much sums up Gloria's youthful career in Mexico. All of this might turn out to be of interest to a run-of-the-mill spy, but in Philby's mind not sufficiently important to take any chances on having to transmit wireless communications to Moscow. So in fact, he was not looking forward to this dinner party and had already decided to make himself a less desirable conversational partner by getting drunk. A not altogether unpleasant thought in itself. Something that made his work enjoyable if the truth was told. On his mind at the moment was his planned visit to the front with key front generals in charge of the upcoming offensive from the fascist salient at Saragossa. Although he would go to present himself to the leading luminaries of international Nazism as a person of positive interest, perhaps useful to them in the future. Attending, he found that the rumors about Gloria were understated. Everywhere were, what then was called, female impersonators, who in actuality were highly feminized males. Men with breasts and large buttocks, both enlarged by hormone treatments. Surgically advanced in their profession via the removal of one or more floating ribs to give a wasp figure, and of course larger breasts. Dressed accordingly as tempting courtesans, they acted as the servants and choreographers of pleasure. And, as Philby was trying to tie himself to an actual woman, in this case Gloria herself, he came face to face with Heinrich Himmler, the person whom had been designated of positive interest to him by his hostess. Spilling the beans. Danger of being earnest. Philby and Himmler. We hope that some arrangement may be reached in the not-too-distant future with your government to join us in the holy war against Bolshevism. Kim responded with, I believe we are trying in The Hague to accommodate that desire. An accord without Hitler. The British rulers had their outright Nazis, but its majority wanted something other than a poor white trash nincompoop at the head of Germany before they would willingly follow a German military adventure against Russia. Class was too important here. Fundamentally, in their eyes, Hitler was just another Cromwell. They had barely survived him. After all, Hitler had not hesitated to duplicate Bolshevik propaganda against the rich, albeit deflecting it against rich Jews, and against their parliamentary form of resolving problems among themselves. A German Cromwell, some said. They were not about to panic to the point of cutting their own throats via a lunatic semi-socialist like Hitler just to get at Stalin. Accordingly, Baldwin had dispatched secret agents to The Hague led by MI600 men, Lieutenant Commanders Stevens and Best, to organize Hitler's assassination and substitution by a responsible German capitalist leader. Philby had been made aware of this by Orloff. There had to be a responsible German at the head of German state and government for the Brits to go along. But so far, the Baldwin initiative via his team in The Hague, to kill Hitler and substitute such a responsible German ruling class leader had been fruitless. But the negotiations had not been broken off. In fact, if he could read between the lines of the Reichsfuhrer's statements, the negotiations were not only ongoing but might well produce positive results. Himmler took Philby's comment as evidence of his high-connected family, e.g., St. John Philby, knowledge and sympathy. A serious error as it turned out. Time will tell Mr. Philby what is possible. I know, what some of my countrymen do not, that your Prime Minister is one of us anti-Bolsheviks and he simply wants a change in our leadership, for obvious reasons, before we come together in common cause, a military final solution against Bolshevism. I have heard many good things about you. We would like you to help us build a bridge of friendship in Britain once this mess in Spain is wrapped up. I will do my best. At which point Gloria took the Reichsfuhrer by the arm saying, Don Himmler, I want you to meet someone or other. And off they went. It had been a rewarding evening after all because Himmler had admitted that he knew about, and therefore that he was involved in the secret dealings between the British PM and other high Reich officials against Hitler. Kim managed to extricate himself early and spent the rest of the evening sobering up, approaching, activating and using his direct contact with the boss. That night he told Stalin what he had uncovered. The radio call came in right after Stalin began his 5-hour nightly sleep and he had to be woken up. It was worth it. Philby told him Hitler's hand-picked secret police boss was in actuality already conspiring against him, Hitler, with personal representatives of the British Prime Minister. Furthermore, their objective would be, if this actually came to pass, a common war against the USSR. Humility. http://www.worldcat.org. Some of our heroes I knew personally. Abraham Lincoln Battalion veteran Steve Nelson, who became my mentor in Oregon in 1963 to 1964, was one of the first, as I have recounted herein and in my autobiography, Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation Volume I. The Buccaneer. Go to for a library near you or get an ebook Kindle 2nd edition. www.amazon.com. Another, Dan Bonnell, a professor of botany at Boise, Idaho, Junior College, who told me in 1962 about executing Italian fascists in 1937 before breakfast. Then it was in Los Angeles while helping Frank Pestana, 1973-1974, I first met veterans Alva Bessie and Irv Goff, among others. When around these men, I always felt somewhat in awe as a young man, as I have described in my autobiography. Nor do only communists feel this way. For example, James A. Michener later lamented his failure to join them when he should have, and no greater popularizer of democratic history exists in our country than Michener. These Idaho Smith books are now available in ebook form at Kindle Books. www.amazon.com. Warning! Be alert! All of these men would turn in their grave if they could see how the FBI got control of their party under the traitor and paid FBI career penetration special agent Sam Webb. This phony party is on its deathbed and shortly will be in the ground. For those of you young people just learning the ropes, let me say the rest of the outfit that inherited the name PUSA is not made up of communists, but of people who comprise a kind of right-wing deviation known throughout the world as modern revisionism. Their sponsors were the old Soviet leadership in the USSR and East Europe. In the USA now they fit in the center of the Clinton Democratic Party, which is where their leaders should go. But then the Webb gang might lose their party incomes and they still have command of extensive cash deposits and real estate holdings. They got the name through historical happenstance, as you will have learned herein, and that is all that remains of their communist origins. The real communists in the USA are elsewhere. Anthropology. Elman Service, Marshall Solins. One of the two most important Marxist cultural anthropologists of our time, Elman Service got his baptism of fire in the Spanish Civil War. He passed away in 1996, 60 years after he volunteered to fight fascism in Spain with us. Immediately upon his return to the U.S., he headed for Columbia University to teach, and after a few years returned to the University of Michigan, where he would spend most of the rest of his life. There he wrote many of the most important anthropological theoretical treatises and ethnological compilations, e.g., Profiles in Ethnology, of the 20th century. Service stayed faithful and true to Marxism throughout his life and was a great inspiration to me and for my own theoretical work long before I realized he was an Abraham Lincoln Battalion veteran. The other most important Marxist cultural anthropologist being Marshall Solins, I have mentioned before several times because of his work, especially Stone Age economics. We will visit some of his Oceania work in Volume 4. Memories of Spain 1936 to 1937. Spain was a war in which Bolshevism had nothing to gain, except, of course, to have another de facto, third world country in the socialist orbit. But that is all it would have been. Socialism, once again, essentially in name only. A poverty-stricken peasant country at an even lower level of development than Russia before Bolshevism. Spanish workers would either have to duplicate the Soviet effort at bootstrapping into the 20th century industrial world or wait for the Russian workers to send them the machinery and factories they would need. The Soviet Union didn't have any extra factories or equipment. It had had to sacrifice everything to modernize as it was. Stalin wouldn't have had to pursue the course he was pursuing if the Soviets had anything extra. Furthermore, Stalin was confronting an inevitable two-front war at that moment. Japan on his eastern frontier and the Baldwin-Chamberlain plan for a London-Berlin-Rome axis on his western one. Even if Spain were to Bolshevize and do everything perfectly, a mirror image of what was then occurring, it would be a third, and impossible to service, front, given the geographical facts of life. In short, Spain was never anything but a pain in the ass for us. But it was one we had to confront, and Stalin did his best to help the Spaniards, who were their own worst enemy, when it came to doing the right thing. Why a pain in the ass? Because of the obvious inability of Spanish workers to do anything to contribute other than maybe holding on to their momentary gains. In Spain we had the 1, 2, 3 independent socialists, largely British with some quasi-Trotskyists under the leader Andrei Snin, Trotsky's former personal secretary, organized as the POM. The real Trotskyists, who were demanding that the Soviet Union join in an international effort to save the Spanish Republic and indeed to spread revolutionary socialist politics to that country. On July 17, 1936, a more backward part of Europe probably did not exist when the fascist army officers' revolt began, at least as far as working-class preparation was concerned. This fatal flaw would soon become apparent as the Civil War unfolded. The most fatal flaw of all being the large number of farmers under the influence of anarchism to which the Stalinist model of the future was anathema. In other words, Bolshevism in 1936 Spain did not have the same kind of farmers as it had had in Tsarist Russia in 1917. For the Soviet Union to intervene directly is exactly what Hitler and Baldwin and Chamberlain wanted. It would terrify the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie in the UK and France and prepare the basis for a London Berlin-Rome axis which would then attack the USSR. This was the objective fact. It was the center of British and French foreign policy from 1933 to 1941. Furthermore, it was the reason Stalin was exactly right in describing Trotsky as an objective ally and agent of Hitler. As we have seen, in that instance Stalin sent international brigades, composed often of bourgeois youth from neighboring countries with democratic, anti-fascist inclinations and many communist youth as well. In fact, the communist youth were the backbone and mainstay of the international brigades, organized by the Yugoslav Joseph Broz Tito, operating then out of Paris under the direct supervision of the boss. And another of Stalin's favorites, a hero of the Bolshevik Revolution itself, Andrei Marty. In 1936, Stalin sent Marty to take command of Comintern troops at Albacete, Spain. Marty had become world famous when he led the French sailors' mutiny that ended the French attempt to intervene in the Russian Civil War, specifically to save White Crimea. Instead, Marty had turned the French fleet against the French capitalist government. Andrei Marty. Marty was born in Perpignan, France, into a left-leaning but comfortable family. His father was a wine merchant. As a youngster, Marty tried to win a place in open competition for the prestigious École Navale, the French Naval Academy, but failed and instead became apprenticed to a boiler maker. He later joined the French Navy, becoming a mechanical engineering warrant officer aboard the battleship Jean Bart. In April 1919, the Jean Bart and another sent to the dreadnought Black Sea, France. White Russians. Russian Civil War. Dreadnought to assist the France were in the war. On April 19, 1919, the crews of the battleships Jean Bart and France mutinied. The sympathies of the crews lay with the Whites, not with the Whites. Andrei Marty organized the crews over the slow rate of their demobilization, following the end of World War I, and the small quantity and atrocious quality of the rations. The French government acceded to the mutineers' demands but pursued the ringleaders. Amongst these were Andrei Marty and Charles Tillon, with whom Marty was to have a lifelong association. Marty was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment at hard labor. He became an international hero overnight, and was symbolically elected to the Soviet of Moscow by the workers of the dynamo factory. In spring 1939, the Spanish Civil War ended. Instead of returning to France, Marty went to the Soviet Union to work full-time for the Comintern. Back to our story. These internationalists saved the day for the Republic and gained Stalin considerable respect. Ernest Hemingway's book For Whom the Bell Tolls is illustrative. The novel's hero Robert Jordan was based on the U.S. communist Robert Merriman. In February 1937, Merriman was the first combat commander of the American Volunteers organized into the Abraham Lincoln Battalion of the XVTH International Brigade. Then it went into combat against the fascists in the battle to break the siege of Madrid. It was well known to the entire world that Hemingway and his future wife, Martha Gellhorn, were strong supporters of the Republic and of the international brigades in particular. Hemingway's and Gellhorn's non-communist status helped the United Front way of fighting for the Popular Front government immensely. Gellhorn maintained a continuous contact in letters with, and a flow of information to, Eleanor Roosevelt. Of course, that meant inside information was being sent on a regular basis to President Roosevelt himself. Stalin vs. Trotsky. 6. Orlov liquidates Trotskyism. The Andrés Nin-led Trotskyists in Barcelona, PUM, had staged a revolt against the Republican government in Barcelona at the most dangerous time for the Republic. That is, the Trot revolt of the PUM in Barcelona occurred during the most critical days in the resistance to the Franco-fascist forces as they drove on Madrid. While Soviet volunteers and internationalists were dying to defend Madrid, the Trots had shown their true colors. This was their undoing because it led Stalin to authorize Orlov to do what Orlov had wanted to do anyway all along. Namely, to liquidate the Trots in Spain. Coming in to help in this regard was the head of the Paris office of the Chaika's Administration for Special Tasks, which was the Soviet equivalent to the O section, licensed to kill James Bond agents in MI6. Yasha Serebryansky and his favorite Spanish Chekist José Costello Pacheco headed the Chekists. Assisting them were 3 more of Orlov's special hitters, also pulled out of France for special work in Spain under the command of Chaika hero Stanislav A. Vovchasov. Stalin had anticipated that Orlov's initial targets would be anarchists. However, by the time Orlov had finished setting up his training schools in Valencia, Barcelona, Bilbao and Argin, the anarchists had pretty well discredited themselves. No longer able to attract revolutionary youth, workers, or anybody not already brainwashed into the anarchist party and its union. Thus they had dropped to a secondary place in the boss's concerns. The Trots, on the other hand, claimed to be communists, and were already the #1 target of the Comintern everywhere in the world where their leader had tentacles. They had made themselves hated in Spain by their treachery in Barcelona and were very vulnerable to being killed without anyone giving much of a shit. The task was delegated to Castello Pacheco in Paris. In Spain, he built a crematorium where the bodies could be incinerated and the ashes dumped into the local sewer. So when Andrés Nin and some 40 other PUM leaders were arrested by the Republican government for treason in Barcelona, they ended up within a week in Pacheco's cremation parlor, although that would not be known for many years yet to come. Across the country, secret Chicao teams liquidated the trots, and the common legend always ended with "has disappeared and has not been seen again." At summer's end 1937, having finished their work in Spain, the hitters packed up their gear and returned to Paris, where they turned their attention to a different set of targets, including killing the last important chief of White Russian counter-revolutionaries, General Y.K. Miller. On September 22, 1937, they hit Miller. In February 1938, they tied off a loose end, disposing of Trotsky's son Lev Sedov. 1937 Spanish gold. Along the way, as he anticipated, the boss managed to get his hands on the 788 tons of treasury gold of the Spanish Republic, and Orlov managed its movement to the Mediterranean, loading all of it on disguised Soviet ships. That money helped the industrialization drive in the USSR immensely. When the gold arrived in Odessa with Orlov sitting on top of it, Orlov was called to Moscow by the boss for a new assignment. An assignment to the USA which would affect the future of the entire world, as it turned out. So Stalin proved again, much as would Fidel Castro decades later, that the best laid plans of the smartest imperialist leaders can be defeated time and time again. Inside snapshot: strange bedfellow Stalin helping himself rather cleverly. May 1, 1937. The war in Spain had turned their way, Madrid was safe. The boss was waiting to walk onto Lenin's mausoleum podium. The May 1st parade beginning. I hate to say it, but we may have to intervene just to be sure they don't succeed. Yeah. I've been thinking the same thing since Philby radioed Himmler's conversation with him. But it's going to be tricky. These are the elements as I see them. We can't tell Hitler who spilled the beans about the Brit hitters in The Hague. If he were to confront Himmler, that lowlife would remember his talk with Philby, and that would be the end of Philby. This should come to Hitler as a favor from me. Those two hitters are in The Hague at Baldwin's order, and this Hitler will find to be true. This should be done in such a way that Hitler would conclude it was that idiot Admiral Canaris. If this is done the right way, Hitler could interpret this as a signal we will not make his regime our #1 enemy in Europe if he doesn't force us into such a posture, and we would like to continue our de facto German alliance we got with the Rapallo Treaty. Otherwise, I am going to choke off all of our oil shipments to their Reich within 7 days, permanently. Then they can continue to negotiate with us over other economic decisions, but no more oil. Which is really what I want. They will not agree, you see, and that is what I want. But they should think they brought this on themselves, Vlad. You see? I need that oil now for our own coal iron steel complexes behind the Urals, about which they know nothing, and I don't want them to know anything, so this should be presented as a tit for tat. Now that's a good idea. Turn the cap plot against them. Get a lot more resources for our behind the Urals industrialization, without them thinking it is anything but political. I just didn't anticipate we could do it by helping Hitler. Anyway, we can pepper the report with so much stuff that could only have come from the Red Orchestra. Hitler will assume Canaris's office to be the source. Another one of our Red Orchestra spies about whom they are already overimpressed. Hitler should use his own personal SS detachment to check out the info about Stevens and Best in The Hague, not the Gestapo or SD, and we can only hope he decides to have them killed. That should put an end to the Baldwin plot for 1937. Even if they escape. No matter what the outcome, this should discourage Baldwin from trying anything like constructing their London-Berlin-Rome axis again right away, at least in the same way. With Hitler on his guard, the Brits will have to figure out something else. Whether this is a win, loss or a draw becomes irrelevant. We will have prevented an easy victory for them in this skirmish. Take care of it, Vlad, and keep me posted step by step. Use Beria and keep the Chaika out of it. Consider it done. And as an historical note, Hitler did decide to eliminate the conspirators. Inside snapshot. June 10, 1937. Which military line? Tukhachevsky affair. Have you decided? Yes, unfortunately, the situation is really tight, but I have no choice. I have decided after all of these tests in Spain we have the financial and industrial resources to develop enough planes and tanks, but only of a few types. Tukhachevsky and gang are wrong about the entire thing. The main thing we must have, that I need, are 20,000 aerial tanks and 20,000 land tanks, better than any the capitalists have or can build in the same time period. With this, and the right army personnel, we can win the inevitable world war about to begin. The rest of this stuff of theirs is way too complicated for an army of the kind we can field at this time. But they can't understand that. An example, as you know, is that they want to build a heavy bomber fleet for a first strike as the final strike capability in the air, and only that, and right now, and that will not work. If the first strike were to fail, what would we then do? For a mirror image of Tukhachevsky's position, see Viktor Suvorov's The Chief Culprit. We know from our own Civil War experience what we need: close air-ground support fighter bombers, and now from our detailed reports on our equipment in Spain, I know exactly what we can do and thereby how we can win in the upcoming fight. They are just as fucked up and unrealistic about the armor force. We can barely build 100,000 Ford trucks now, let alone 100,000 tanks. By the way, I think this first fight may come in Mongolia based on what Sorg is telling me. I want my tanks and my planes ready for that fight, or whichever comes first. It's time to force the military reorganization issue, and then the military-industrial complex reorganization. Is Beria ready? That's my job, and I am going to do it now. As I said, I don't want you there, as I want it clear I respect all of my colleagues and am not trying to stack the deck with votes, which we easily could. It is this information and cover letter from Czechoslovak President Benes about the Tukhachevsky plot that will carry the day, or it will not. On top of all the data so far accumulated by SMRSH through Beria, I think they will agree, and we will have prevailed without several votes they would have considered automatic for my side. Anyway, it is either or now. Wish me luck. The boss walked out of his Kremlin office to meet with the Politburo on the key question of the arrest of Marshal Tukhachevsky and fellow co-conspirators. On this meeting, the history of the world would depend. Philby wins Red Ruby international fame. Philby was always in danger in Spain just by being there, and always at the front. On December 31, 1937, New Year's Eve, while driving from Saragossa to the Teruel front, a Soviet artillery shell exploded 2 to 3 meters from the car he was riding in and killed all of its occupants, except him. Dying that night were Reuters correspondent Dick Sheepshanks, Newsweek correspondent Bradish Johnson, and Associated Press correspondent Eddie Neal. Philby walked away. The next day was his 26th birthday, January 1, 1938. Philby wrote a good report for the London Times about the incident and about Franco and the fascist general's concern for foreign correspondents such as himself. For this he was rewarded by Franco a few weeks later, standing on his tiptoes, pinning the Order of the Red Ruby for courage on Kim's chest, and then the fascist hero kissed Philby on both cheeks in the presentation. First Franco and then Philby gave short speeches, there were photo ops for the press with the two shaking hands, and the ceremony was over. In the meantime, this incident, and the presentation, made Philby world famous. The London Times chief editor Geoffrey Dawson congratulated Philby on doing what no English journalist had succeeded in doing so far, namely being accepted in the highest Francoist circles, and in such an outstanding way. From that moment forward, wherever Philby went, the door was wide open and Philby gathered Franco war plans for Stalin by the truckload. For the times Philby could do no wrong and walked on water. This was of course exactly what Stalin wanted, and Yezhov would have prevented with his stupid plot to have Philby kill Franco. If successful, the Spanish fascists would simply have appointed a new commander, of which several were waiting in the wings. Stalin would have lost his then would-be most important agent in Brit intelligence. At any rate, this little episode weighed heavily in Philby's favor when recruitment into MI6 came up 3 years later. Understanding 1930s purges. Preventing a fifth column against proletarian dictatorship. There had been purges in the Bolshevik Party literally from its inception. Purges are one form of ideological control over any political party, and when one has a political movement, as fractured from the beginning as the Russian social democracy movement was, it was inevitable that positions would solidify into different camps. Why inevitable? Because factions within a movement or party represent different special sectors of society with inherently antagonistic interests. In the epoch of class society, i.e., the servitude epoch of slavery, feudalism and capitalism, there is nothing but antagonistic contradictions between contending classes. At any rate, the Bolsheviks soon split with the Mensheviks, so that by 1905 Spark, Iskra, had been ditched as far as the Bolsheviks were concerned. Replaced with Forward, which after one issue changed its name to Proletarian. This reflected the division of the social democratic movement into its two principal wings, with a variety of hangers-on individualists such as Leon Trotsky with their own minuscule fractions. It was a reflection of the division of the anti-monarchy front of workers into those wishing to fight directly for socialism and communism, and those who were more than happy to settle for the role of capitalist overseers, with a lot of individualist opportunists in between. There were ongoing purges of former Leninists within the Bolshevik Party from 1905 through 1917. In power, after 1917, the Soviet Party confronted one crisis after another, which resulted in the 1920s in the need to B. Not so long thereafter, to expel nearly as many, for one reason or another. The period we are primarily concerned with in this chapter when we speak of purges in the Soviet Party is the period of 1937 to 38. In those years there were three main categories subjected to excision. 1, 2, 3. You will note the reason we are discussing this matter at this point in the textbook is because the Spanish Civil War is just beginning and Stalin has decided to intervene in Spain along the lines just reviewed. The first principal feature of the fascist army officers' uprising in Spain had been mutiny, treason, and subversion of the legally elected democratic government of popular forces. Secret subversion in the Spanish army, secret organization of military mutiny throughout the nation, and the suborning of treason with cash everywhere had been the fascist road to insurrectionary power. On September 26, 1936, Stalin realized that Cheka chief G. Yagoda was not up to the task confronting the international working class movement, appointing N.I. Yezhov. Struggle against fifth columnists. The class structure in Soviet Russia was entirely different than the class structure of the same time period in Spain for reasons we have already discussed extensively in this volume. However, the danger of hidden enemies within the Soviet Union was just as great as the danger from hidden enemies inside the Spanish Republic. Such hidden enemies were endemic among the bourgeois specialists in charge of Soviet industry, as in the Shakti affair we discussed above. The Spanish fascists of Franco's newly adopted and controlled Falange Party were already using the term fifth column to describe their conspiratorial subversion inside the Republic. In September 1936, Franco's four columns took aim at Madrid. He bragged of having a fifth column inside the Republic itself which would rise up when the word was given to subvert the Republic from within. It didn't work out that way, at least not for 2.5 more years, but not for lack of trying. The term was immediately understood and incorporated into the lexicon of Bolshevik terminology at the same time, and Stalin launched a sophisticated program of negating a fifth column inside the working class bastion of the USSR. This began with the biographical purge. It continued through the farmer abuser purge and along the way featured judicial purges of enemies of Bolshevism in the party, government, and state. A fifth column could be constructed from anti-Soviet elements of a variety of types. 1. The Chaika was always assembling lists of former church officials, former Tsarist army and navy officers, former landowners, and so forth. This was one component of class enemies and they were obviously to be rounded up, exiled, or shot. 2. Another and far more dangerous sector of society were the former Communist Party members expelled for one reason or another. It was this second sector which comprised the primary targets of the purge of 1937 to 38. 3. A third and just as dangerous element were the millions of former rich farmers, kulaks, deported to Siberia or Soviet Central Asia, some of whom were returning after their 5 years of enforced exile. 4. A fourth category consisted of the sons and daughters of these former rich farmers who were entitled to full citizenship rights upon application and approval and who also would be coming into the heartland of the Soviet Union for education and employment. 5. A fifth category consisted of currently serving party bosses in the collective farms. The Chaika proceeded against these categories in different ways, but in totality these were the targets of the biographical purges of 1937 to 38. Note that these targets were entirely separate from the 6. Category of specific individual targets of party army leaders receiving the attention of the international cap press. Farmer abusers in 1917, nearly 100% of the feminine farmer population was illiterate, and about 95% of the male component. By the 1930s, nearly every farmer, male and female, could read and write thanks to the Bolshevik literacy campaign, and every farmer family had children who had been to school and could handle the family correspondence if necessary. Farmers had become inveterate letter writers. When pissed off, which was much of the time, they wrote letters. Farmers wrote to everybody they thought might resolve their problems with local authorities, including Comrade Stalin. All you had to do to get a letter to Stalin was to write his name on the envelope. Comrade Stalin, Moscow, would suffice. More interestingly is that all such addressed letters got to the boss, immediately. Molotov got a lot, as did President Kalinin, and so forth. Stalin's secretariat got countless bags of letters on a daily basis, and amazingly every single one was read by someone, and agents were immediately dispatched to resolve the problems of John Deere farmer and family. Furthermore, if something really bad was being reported in these letters, they were instantly forwarded to the boss. God help the bureaucrat who failed in this regard. Beginning in March 1937, Stalin ordered that the Politburo be informed of every development in legal actions being taken against farmer abusers. Trials of party bureaucrats abusing farmers were undertaken, and throughout 1937 and 1,938 thousands of trials were conducted throughout the agricultural regions of the USSR, featuring farmers brought to testify formally against their abusers. All of this was reported faithfully in the press of every locality. In the end, one principal reason collectivization was successful was because Stalin oversaw a process of remedy for every farmer who felt he had been abused by his collective farm boss. The truth about numbers executed. One of the most important arrows in the capitalist and Trotskyite quiver of anti-Stalin projectiles is the one that Stalin was jealous and or frightened of Red Army generals, like Tukhachevsky, and also being psychopathically paranoid, he ordered the execution of some 40,000 Red Army officers. This is a complete and total lie invented from whole cloth by Trotsky in exile and picked up by the hack writers of the chief imperialist propagandists, including and especially Robert Paine and Robert Conrad. Allowed to stand unchallenged, this total lie leads the same people to conclude that the reason the Nazis did as well as they did in the first 5 months of the war in 1941 is because all the competent commanders had been executed by Stalin, with some 40,000 having only been at their jobs for less than 4 years at most. The truth is the Nazis did as well as they did between June 22 and December 5, 1941 because they moved first. They moved first with 3.5 million men. Aggressors always do best because whoever moves first has all the advantages and should succeed in initial objectives if they have any competence at all. This is why white is preferred to black in chess. In the real world, the Germans were competent and efficient. We now have the records from official Russian sources which all historians, as far as I know, agree are authentic. What do these records have to say about the number of Red Army officers arrested, sentenced, including those shot, and rehabilitated in 1937 to 1938? We know that in February of 1937 the Red Army Officer Corps numbered 206,000, for a total Red Army size of 1,100,000. In fact, 40,000 of this 206,000 total would have been 19.4% of the total. If this is true, how could it be, if what they say is true, that on June 22, 1941, over 50% of the Red Army officers had less than 1 year's experience on the job, which is what they claim? Obviously this cannot be true. What was true is that the Red Army had a well-trained and tested officer corps on June 22, 1941, and nothing unusual had preceded the outbreak of war in terms of officers removed. This 40,000 false figure was derived from 1954 statistics presented to the party by Nikita Khrushchev in 1956. His figure was derived from the 1937 figure for numbers of the Red Army dismissed, which were 20,643, and the 1938 figure for numbers of the Red Army soldiery dismissed, which were 16,118. A total of 36,761. Rounded off, he got 40,000. The problem lies not with the figures but with the assumptive definitions. For example, some men are dismissed for X reason, others Y, and still others for Z reasons. A small fraction of those dismissed are dismissed by execution. Propagandists, e.g. Paine and Conrad, made the completely unjustified assumption that dismissal was equivalent to execution. The truth is, of the 36,761 dismissed, some 10,868 were arrested. Of those arrested, only 1,654 were executed or died in prison prior to trial. Let's say it again. The so-called Stalin shooting purge of the military to the tune of 40,000 men turns out to be 1,654 executed or died while in custody. You cadres should take note of the gross lies our people have been taught and the utility of checking every single fact these historians try to palm off on you. Don't trust anyone. Check every single thing. Millions of Soviet youth learned how to shoot beginning in 1930, and continuing throughout that decade millions of Soviet youth were encouraged to become marksmen, which included girls as well as boys. This meant that an entire generation had learned how to shoot by the time the Second World War began for us June 22, 1941. It also shows the government was always self-confident even during the worst of the collectivization years, or it certainly would not have armed tens of millions of strong young people. Halifax gives Hitler the green light. November 1937. In November 1937, longtime British Nazi fellow traveler, Lord Halifax, was sent as British Foreign Minister to be, 3 months later, to see Hitler. There he assured Hitler that Britain would not look askance at any of his demands on Austria, Czechoslovakia and the Danzig Corridor, and that Britain appreciated Hitler's acting as a bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe even if it had some reservations about his anti-Semitism and a few other, minor, things. The entire transcript of Halifax's secret conversations at the Eagle's Nest in Germany with Hitler was provided to Stalin by both Cairncross and Maclean independently. Thus, on top of Philby's reporting of Brit plotting, Stalin had both of these separate source intelligence experts telling him the same thing. The Brit regime was pulling out all the stops by the end of the first full year of civil war in Spain in favor of fascism and had now gone to the long-dreaded extreme of being willing to accept Hitler as the boss of an anti-Soviet European capitalist, anti-Comintern Grand Alliance. There would be no more Brit attempts to kill Hitler and substitute someone else. For more inside details see The Sword and Shield, The Mitrokhin Archive and the Secret History of the KGB by Christopher Andrew and Vasily Mitrokhin, 1999:65-66, Basic Books, New York 700 pp. 1938 Mess in Spain resolves itself. In my frank opinion, in the end we were far better off not having this distraction, Spain, in the way, than we would have been with a permanent government of beggars in Madrid, which is what any Spanish left government would have ended up being. It was almost 1939, and the time had come to get serious. Stalin confronted the probability of a two-front war, one against Japan and another against Germany, England, France, Italy, and certainly did not need a third front in Spain. We had given Spain our best shot, and we were insufficient. Probably this was just as well given the way the war ended up in 1939. Our out was provided by Hitler when he succeeded against Czechoslovakia and the Spanish Republicans asked us to leave. International brigades withdrawn on September 30, 1938, it was clear that England and France were going all the way in selling out democracy in continental Europe. They signed the giveaway of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. Both the British and French regimes were fully committed to urging Hitler to war against the USSR and would pull out all the stops. Stalin decided the simultaneous position in 1938 of the Spanish Republican boobs to ask all foreign volunteers to leave Spain and throw the Republican cause onto the mercy of England and France was an excellent excuse to disengage Soviet and Comintern forces, and he gave the order instantly the moment Chamberlain signed away Czechoslovakia September 30, 1938. On November 15, 1938, 6 weeks later, the Internationals made a farewell march through Barcelona and they were gone, as were Soviet tank crews and pilots. In January 1939, the end came when Stalin, who had done his best to help every step of the way, and when they had no remaining credit, sent the Republican government over $100 million in arms. This even after he knew they would be defeated in 1939. Franco declared victory on April 1, 1939. An old revolutionary himself, Stalin found it emotionally impossible to leave these incompetents to their own well-deserved end without giving them every possible option to win. The arms were shipped, but most of the ships were stopped by the French before they could discharge their cargoes. On February 27, 1939, the British and French capitalist regimes decided to recognize the Franco-insurgent government, then headquartered at Burgos, thus abandoning the last of the embattled continental European democracies to fascism. On April 1, 1939, the USA recognized Franco, sealing the deal. On that day, Franco declared the Civil War over. The beginning of the long period of retribution authorized by Franco's first law of political responsibilities got underway. This was the Gestapo type of authorization to search for and kill all those who had opposed Franco. Hundreds of thousands of people ran for the French border and political asylum in the USSR and Mexico, these being only two countries to consistently support the Republic before and after its defeat. In Mexico City, the Spanish left, and its government in exile eventually concentrated. When I arrived in Mexico City, 23 years later, at the end of August 1962, I met many of the Republic's then remaining officials. Inside snapshot: the longest shot Orlov to FDR. August 21, 1938. Koba, this is for you. Yezhov's hands were trembling when he handed it to me. He said, "For your eyes only? It's from Orlov. If that fucking dwarf has fucked this up too, this will be his last day. Let me have it." The boss read the letter once, then again. Then a third time. Vyacheslav Molotov knew what this meant. The boss wasn't yelling, so Orlov must have sent some relatively good news. Actually, they had known for several weeks that their top spy master for Western Europe, Leva Lazarevic Felbin, code-named Alexander Orlov, had defected. But to whom and for what reward was still unknown. The boss said he believed that Orlov would not defect all the way, that he was just trying to protect himself from the murderous machinations of the secret police chief Yezhov. Molotov already knew Yezhov was going to go the way of his predecessor Yagoda and his underlings. Koba had been extremely angry. The only reason Yezhov was still alive was because the boss hadn't gotten to the bottom of the mess in Western European NKVD operations. Molotov knew that Joseph Stalin had been pinning great hopes on the intelligence he expected certain Cheka agents and their apparats to provide during the coming World War, now so close. Between Philby, the other Orlov spies in England, the Red Orchestra in Germany, especially Richard Sorg and his apparat of spies operating in Germany, China and Japan, the boss had had all his bases covered until this. Until the boss said the dwarf fucked everything up. Dwarf was Stalin's pejorative for Yezhov, head of NKVD domestic and foreign operations. You can read it. Here. The boss handed Molotov the letter written by Orlov in his own hand and delivered by special courier from New York via the Soviet embassy in Paris. They had been waiting for it since receiving a cable from Paris that it had arrived. In short, he says he is still with us ideologically and always will be and will go to the grave with his secrets if I leave him alone. Otherwise he will give everything he knows to the Americans, and he has sent along a list of agents he ran in Europe for me to see and confirm with Yezhov. His lawyer has a copy, and if anything happens to him it will all go to the FBI. Vlad, we will leave him alone, and hope for the best. I don't believe a word of it, Koba. Why don't you believe it? Orlov would drink lie before he would betray us. Betray you? You don't have to comment on this, but I think you sent him on some mission. The boss said nothing at first, then continued as if Molotov had said nothing. Get Beria in here. It's time to put the new intelligence reorganization in place. That little cocksucker Yezhov has fucked me in the ass for the last time. This is his entire fault. Just like he has fucked up the Bukharin trial. All he had to do was to get Bukharin to admit to what he has already admitted to Sergo, Klima and other comrades years ago. But no, he had to create more Trotskyite conspiracies, and you know what happened. Not to mention the stupidity of even considering using Philby to kill Franco. I should have shot the dwarf myself then. I must be getting soft. And Vlad, keep your thoughts to yourself. What thoughts? Beria appeared instantly. Yes, Koba? This time Yezhov has to go. You know what to do. You're taking over. Thank you, Koba. You're welcome. Now look, many of our foreign operations have been all fucked up since Felix died, 10 years ago, and gotten worse with each subsequent chief. Mesh did his best, but he started out losing the MOC risks. Not that I gave a shit, as you know, laughing, but it was symptomatic of what was to come. First that asshole Yagoda, and now Yezhov. I want you to put permanent order into Chaikau abroad. Can you do that for me? Yes, Koba, I can and I will. I have been giving this a lot of thought. I know what to do, and to begin with we need to put our European networks at ease. Orlov says Yezhov has scared the shit out of a lot of people and discouraged just about everybody else with his terrible personal attitudes. I'll take care of it and get this problem off of your shoulders. You're a good man, Beria. I know you can do this. I remember how well you ran our intelligence operations in the Transcaucasus in the old days. And last but certainly not least, you worked hand in glove with Orlov and his wife Maria Rodonslav, fighting the counter-revolutionaries in the Caucasus, for 2 years? Yes. I'd better go get Yezhov myself. Is there anything more? No, that will do it. But come to the Kremlin movie room tonight. Thank you, comrade. Yezhov was replaced. Beria did take over and stayed on as Soviet intelligence boss until Stalin's death. With Lavrenti Beria, Stalin finally had his replacement for his good friend and reliable secret police chief Felix Dzerzhinsky. Orlov's demand appeared to be carefully honored. In fact, Orlov's old friend Beria as his new controller. Among the controller's duties was sending him money. Beria maintained a highly secret radio contact with Orlov on a regular basis. To any party person who might learn of the situation, Stalin was simply committed to honoring a personal understanding. Yet, it was always a matter of historical record. Orlov never talked. The understanding, misunderstood abroad. Why? As Molotov guessed, the boss had sent Orlov on a mission. This time to bring the USA into the inevitable coming war on the right side. A mission so secret and so well funded, originally only 2 men in the world knew about it. The boss and Orlov. But if Orlov's true location were known, then others could figure out the same thing. Others like Nazi intelligence, Italian fascist intelligence, Japanese military intelligence, and so forth. Among communists, and for many years, only Molotov and Beria were in on the secret. Red intelligence reorganization in Western Europe. Within a year things would be back to normal in Western Europe as far as Red intelligence was concerned. But it would take Beria a year to do it. It would not be until after Hitler marched into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and Britain and France declared war on the 3rd, after much soul-searching, for they had spent the same year trying to be sure that the Baldwin-Chamberlain plot to form a London-Berlin-Rome axis was successful, that Stalin would feel comfortable with the clean-up. He then ordered his new West European spy master Pavel A. Sudoplativ to reactivate Orlov's agents. Subsequently, Sudoplativ has written his own history of these years, Special Tasks, 1994, Little Brown, London. Meanwhile, Philby heard bits and pieces and gathered that Orlov had been reassigned but spent the year more or less on his own, building his ties in every conceivable way to MI6. Finally, thanks to his own efforts, and the efforts of always loyal and reliable, on the job, never discouraged, Guy Burgess, the MI6 contact came. Philby had been recruited originally by Arnold Deutsch under Orlov. Orlov took personal control of Philby in January 1935. Simultaneously his, to-be, new fourth, Soviet controller A.V. Gorsky, was selected in Moscow by the boss, Molotov, Beria and Sudoplativ. Accordingly, Orlov's Moscow spy master replacement, Sudoplativ, sent his top London embassy agent, Gorsky, to Philby et al. once again. Stalin's decision a fortuitous, if perfectly timed, circumstance for Philby and for the Soviet Union. It would be a half-century before it was known to anyone other than the boss and Molotov that the prodding for help from MI6 came from the top Soviet agent in MI5. This prodding from London was the immediate cause, the trigger if you will, that led to Sudoplatov re-establishing operational contact with Philby et.al. This had been done at Sudoplatov's instruction, with Stalin's approval, because of this entirely separate recruit from the Cheka. Namely, a China recruit of the Red Army's intelligence division, who had become a high-ranking officer in Britain's Internal Security Service MI5. It was this recruit Roger Hollis, who had warned Stalin earlier that Arnold Deutsch, the group controller, under Orlov for the Cambridge Five was under MI5 surveillance. Stalin told Orlov and Orlov took direct control of Philby, Burgess and McLean in February of 1935. There were in reality two Soviet intelligence operators in Britain because Dzerzhinsky had decided, in order to prevent duplication and tripping over one another, this agent and his group, having been originally recruited by Red Army G2, would be inserted into the other half of the British Secret Service, the Internal Security Service MI5. In other words, up until this time the sole operator had been the Cheka, and its agents were in the License to Kill Foreign Secret Operations Service MI6. Now, known only to Stalin and Red Army G2, there was a second operator, and its agents were in MI5. NKVD, Cheka, had known nothing of this Red Army G2 operation inside the British Security Service MI5, E.G. Hollis, not to mention the Duchess of Windsor. The Cheka's operation was focused on SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service or MI6, which is where the Cheka operated Philby, Burgess, McLean, Blunt and Cairncross. These other spies in Britain's Internal Security Service or MI5 had been recruited by Red Army G2 in China. Their number one was named Roger Hollis. Hollis was asking that what support could be roused from MI6, be so roused, and coordinated with his own work in MI5. The objective? Hunt down and kill Nazi spies operating in Great Britain with foreign controllers. Keystone Cops Charlie Chaplin, John Dillinger, Felix Dzerzhinsky. The boss had no life outside of the party life he had chosen. So, for personal recreation he often relaxed with his closest friends and associates after midnight, and before 5 a.m. Moscow time, in the Kremlin movie room. The boss slept from 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. every day, as did, consequently, all of his generals and admirals. This night Stalin and Beria were sitting next to each other because the boss wanted to talk with him during the intermission. Lev, I laughed so hard at those Keystone Cops I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I noticed. But you need this Koba. I don't know how you do it. 30 years now, day and night, and how often do you sleep? I know. 5 hours a night. Otherwise you are at the job all day and night every day of the year. The people know it, and the party knows it. We admire you but worry about you. It's good to laugh, and the Americans do make the best movies and newsreels, no doubt about that. I can't believe it. Chaplin makes fun of Hitler, the Keystone Cops illustrate the inadequacy of the American police, and John Dillinger makes an absolute ass of all of them. Anyway, Lav, I wanted to talk to you about this mess in the Cheka's foreign operations. I have the situation in hand, Koba, don't worry. I know you do. As usual, you are doing an absolutely superb job. But here is the point. This is my fault at bottom. You see, I should have paid the closest attention to the Cheka when Felix died, but I did not. I assumed that the wonderful organization he had in place would simply evolve naturally as such bureaus always do, and that his hand-picked men would succeed him. And do as he had done. But in practice, it turns out that Mesh, for example, was good precisely because he was methodical, not because he had Felix's unerring ability to find enemies and get his hands around their throats personally. What I did not sufficiently realize was that in fact the reason the Cheka worked so well is because Felix provided all the ideological drive necessary to kill our enemies, and men like Mesh cleaned up the bureaucratic mess behind him. Beria responded. You're right about Felix. He could not wait to actually get his hands around the throats of our enemies, and he did a fucking good job at killing them. I like the meat in the stew test. Remember, in the Civil War he told the Chekists to go into the kitchen of suspect farmers and check the stew. If there was meat in it, shoot them. Koba, I went with him to the Ukraine in 1918 to liquidate the anarchist army. He was to get the Ukrainian Chekists to root out the hidden black hundreds which were everywhere in the Ukraine and Belarusia, as you know. The first day I finished early with the army men and went to meet him, so I heard his talk. Koba, I never heard anything like it. He made my blood run cold. Me! He told them, you are here because you are Jews like me and you know what these evil creatures do. I saw them rape and murder my mother and my sisters and draw and quarter my father when I was 10 years old. I picked the rest of you because you are from these parts of the old empire, and you know without me having to tell you what they are and what we owe to them. Besides, we are also Bolsheviks, and we need to liquidate them for that reason too. You are being given lists. Kill everyone on these lists and their families and round up and shoot their friends too, and their families. Or if you are feeling exceptionally kindly, send the latter to prison. Do not even think of coming back here alive if you fail in any way to carry out your instructions, because if you should have such audacity, I will personally blow your fucking head off. Now do you understand me? Amazingly, Koba, they stood and cheered. We never had to worry once we unleashed Felix on an enemy. But you know Felix is not a Jew. Later I asked him about this, and he said something to the effect of these Jewish Chekists are our very best anti-pogromist fighters, and this is a way of bonding with them. I confronted him about this story once, and he told me the same thing. I let it go. Lav, do you remember after Illich was shot, 1918, and Felix took over all police work, the crime rate went to fucking zero. He rounded up all those displaced kids and sent them to army Kamasomo camps. Many are now our leading cadre. So anyway, guys like Yagoda made their way to the top after Mesh passed. Then this asshole Yezhov. I should have appointed you when Felix died. And we are now paying the price for my mistake. What can we learn from this? What do you think you have learned from this, Koba? Illich, Lenin, used to worry about this generation, us old Bolsheviks, standing in the way of the new generation at precisely the time we need to admit we will need this generation and perhaps one or two more to do the job of getting the Soviet Republic ready to lead a global socialist revolution. I had hoped the Chaika would play a role in being sure that did not happen. Instead, I let the Chaika fall under the direction of a new generation of opportunists, not a new generation of Bolsheviks. A new generation of evil, self-aggrandizing, undercover capitalist agents. Yagoda and now Yezhov are examples. For the moment we will go back to old Bolsheviks, namely you, but we need to be trying to create a new generation of fanatical, true-believing Bolshevik secret policemen. If we can't do that, we will fail. Thank you for your thoughts, Koba. That's pretty deep. I need time to think about what you have said. All right? Of course. That's why these informal movie get-togethers are so important. Perhaps I am all fucked up on this. Let me know what you think when you are ready. Now it looks like they are ready for the Chaplin movie. Summing it up. All that having been said, what if anything did we get out of that Spanish shithole? This is what David Alfaro Siqueiros, commander of the Mexican and other Latin American volunteers, told me the day he was released from prison in Mexico City, in 1965, as the phrase used by Comrade K. to him when he gave him the order to put the Latinos together and go back to Mexico. Comrade K was Stalin's incoming handpicked chief of Chaika intelligence for Spain under Franco. Comrade K was a Polish comrade who entered Spain under the incoming Franco regime, as a businessman. I have codenamed this agent as Comrade K, and I have kept the name secret because of his daughters who are still alive. Ed. See Book 1 of my autobiographical series for the setting and details of these conversations. The answer is, we got more than we expected to get given the disaster caused by ultraleftism in Spain and its supporters around the globe. Namely, 788 tons of gold, Soviet troops transported to waiting ships disguised as trade freighters. It was Orlov's last critical task in Spain before being called for New York, and is a fascinating story in and of itself. However, our point is that with 788 tons of gold, any world-class financier, such as Joseph Stalin, could have built 10 brand new steel factory complexes that would make Pittsburgh choke in amazement. Frankly, that in and of itself would have made our intervention in that chaotic fight worth it. Stalin did use it to finish the Soviet steel industry, which by 1941 was producing more than anyone else in the world. In addition, we got invaluable training in regular and guerrilla warfare of every type, essential as time would prove, in many revolutionary struggles across the globe. E.g., Tito used the men who survived the Spanish War he had channeled to Spain from Yugoslavia and East Europe to become his cadre in his National Liberation Army for Yugoslavia during World War II. One of these officers, Alberto Bayo, expert in guerrilla warfare, Fidel Castro hired to teach guerrilla warfare to his men in Mexico, before they departed to start the Revolutionary War in Cuba, December 1956. Che Guevara graduated number 1 in that course, despite the fact he was there as the 26th of July movement's medic, and continuing as a matter of interest to me as well as why this, Colonel Alberto Bayo Giroux, the Cuban originating trainer who fought Franco in Spain and fought the gringo stooge Anastasio Somoza later, had a falling out with Fidel, at some point before the Cubans departed Mexico to land in Cuba. My guess is that Bayo, like so many others, who would make the same mistake in the future, thought he knew better than Fidel about how to conduct the Cuban Revolution. Like so many after him, who failed to see Fidel's unerring accuracy as a commander-in-chief of the Cuban Revolution, found they had parted ways. Even Che Guevara said later his only mistake had been in not initially understanding Fidel Castro's perfect accuracy in determining the course of the Cuban Revolution. Something he corrected early on, he said, and was thereafter unswervingly loyal to the command ante. Finally, By World War II, we had an army of tens of thousands of agents for the Cheka who could and would be used everywhere in the world where volunteers were needed by the party and its sword and shield. It was Lenin who first described the Cheka as the sword and shield of the proletarian revolution. Of these fighters, one of my favorites was David Crook, an English pilot who flew for Galen in China and later for us, not only in Spain but in many other quiet wars. Another story for a book yet to come. David Crook, August 14, 1910 to November 1, 2000, was a British-born communist and international Chekist who in his later years became a permanent resident in China. A committed Marxist. International Brigades during the International Brigades. Spanish Civil War. KGB. China. Second Sino-Japanese War. 1937 to 45. There he met and married his wife, Isabel, a teacher and social activist. Following the Second World War and the Chinese Civil War, the couple stayed in China and taught English. He came to Los Angeles twice, and I had an opportunity to listen to his lectures on the Chinese Revolution on both occasions. In 1959, the Crooks published Revolution in a Chinese Village, 10 Mile In, and in 1966 came the first years of Yangtze Commune. Crook died at 90 after spending his last 5 decades in China, his political beliefs firm despite 5 years' imprisonment during the Cultural Revolution. Ramon Mercader is another favorite Spanish veteran of mine. He was the assassin of Trotsky, operating under the orders of the Cheka chief for the Western Hemisphere, Leonid Eidingen. Eidingen was Orlov's deputy in Spain and later in the USA. Eidingen was a Chekist who subsequently told the Trotsky matter details in his autobiography. The Cheka's continued use of people such as Ramon Mercader, who had personal experience reasons for hating the enemies the Bolsheviks confronted anywhere, anytime. In this case, the assassin was a Spanish veteran with a deep hatred of Trotsky because of the counter-revolutionary role he believed Trotsky's gang played in Spain, especially in their revolt in Barcelona during the critical Battle for Madrid, November 1936 to March 1937, which was very harmful in many ways. Our party steeled and blooded. Finally, for us specifically in the USA, the war in Spain helped the PUSA immensely in propaganda terms. Party writers correctly squeezed every drop of press goodness and heroism out of the actions of its fighters in Spain, who were the overwhelming majority of the US contingent, and the party's membership expanded exponentially after 1936. North American communists had taken on a new and heroic image in the minds of the masses because of their leading the fight in Spain. As you will see in the next chapter, the PUSA and its leaders and members became very active in supporting our industrial espionage program in North America. Also, North American communists assisted in every way, when asked, in our atomic espionage program. They had grown up and accepted the responsibility of any real communist, which is to always put class struggle interests ahead of any other interests, which meant at that time to assist the first home base of the world socialist stage, the USSR, in any and every way possible. The Spanish War had steeled them. They had been blooded. In short, our intervention in Spain turned out quite well in every respect for us at home and many other revolutionary movements in other countries as well. Losing the war was the fault of the Republican government in Spain. A bigger bunch of incompetent boobs than the Spanish Republican government probably never existed in 20th century Europe. Despite every imaginable attempt at creating an effective officer corps and technical arm, even the self-sacrificing internationalists could not save the Spanish Republicans from themselves. Internationalism, Spain, and among the givens, or fundamental premises of the Marxist theory of capitalism is that the capitalists always have the entire world as their market and source of cheap labor, not just the nations in which they exist and run their factories. This flows logically from the fact of assembly line production of standardized parts, enabling the most ignorant, untrained farmer to participate in manufacturing the most complex capitalist machinery and the concomitant that anyone, any age, any sex, anywhere, will do. In this way, capitalism democratized labor and labor power in the servitude epoch. Accordingly, the working class response, as a class, is to confront the capitalists as a worldwide class. In practical terms, this means workers in a fight in one country should be able to call upon workers in other countries to assist them, since the fight of one is ultimately the fight of all. It is this, sharing of funds and other, too, similar support, such as killing and maiming would-be scabs from continental origins, which brought the labor aristocrats of England and Germany together with Marx in the First International. Persecution of U.S. families today. The capitalists were already organized with their governments in place and most importantly with their state, military and police in place. This was and is for that matter the basis of organization of all capitalist societies. Remember the golden rule: labor discipline not based on force in any class society is impossible. In short, their system of governance, whatever governing form that may have been, or may be now, or may be in the future, and their labor discipline has only one fundamental objective. That is forcing workers to accept wage slavery or suffer the consequences. These consequences being torture, prison, assassination, execution, isolation, deportation, and every form of persecution imaginable in civil society. The removal of millions of families from their homes and into unemployment, as has been occurring in the USA for decades, is the most modern manifestation. Historically, our organized response as Bolsheviks began with the First International of Workingmen, of which Karl Marx became the General Secretary. It was preceded by trade unionism, in various forms including its most sophisticated political adventures such as British Chartism and various political parties of trade unions in the New Republic, i.e., USA from 1819 to 1861, see Part 3 below. Steve taught me. Steve Nelson taught me a great deal. In this subject matter we are currently discussing, Steve put it to me the way I am recalling it as a lesson plan in the following several pages. In the retrospective view of 5 decades I can only say it is a worthwhile approach, but not the only way of categorizing these years, even from our perspective. On the other hand, what Steve taught me does deal with critical issues in an acceptable, believable manner, and is, therefore, worth your attention now. Practical problem of the first. The way Marx kicked off the First International, in a masterful handling of an incredible multitude of international political factions, can be seen in his inaugural address of a month later. Some would-be participants had to be convinced that this was not their organization and volunteered to leave. Furthermore, the English non-electoral political labor aristocrats had to be convinced that the refusal of foreign comrades to allow scab specialist workers to be exported to London, and the ability of these foreign comrades to enforce this prohibition, was worth their paying lip service to the socialist idea of what society should be about. And believe it or not, there were many even more vexing tactical problems. Marx had to resolve all of this, and he did so in 3 points. You should take the time to read this 9-page paper. Practical problem of anarchism. Once the International got sorted out in terms of member organizations and why they were accepted as members, or not in some cases, anarchism became a danger in Europe. Why? Because, unlike the earlier utopian anarchists of the French leader Proudhon, these modern Bakunin anarchists insisted on enrolling the agricultural masses into our industrial working class organization, the First International of Workingmen. Even if these illiterate, and thus ignorant, European farmers had not been under the influence of organized anarchism and its fallacious doctrines, e.g., their total misunderstanding of the role of this state in socio-cultural evolution, recruiting them would have been tricky enough. This was true precisely, and only, because of their low level of educational achievement, beginning with their almost 100% illiteracy. These degraded European slave-serf farmers were our genetic equals, but certainly not our cultural, in this case intellectual, equals. That was the nature of the servitude system in which they had been born and forced to live. Therefore, the revolution for this new world socio-cultural evolutionary stage, we had and have to come to call socialism, had begun this way it had. In fact, it certainly would justify the coming existence of our Leninist party, and for that matter of ourselves. That was the problem. How to make these potentially capable potential workers be jumped ahead several decades, so what they could be for themselves, and what they could contribute for our mutual benefit, in a very short period of time, could be made real. As it was, our industrial workers stood to be overwhelmed by the masses of dehumanized continental farmer masses within our own organization. That could not be allowed to happen. We certainly did not need such non-proletarian masses demagogued into an anti-Marxist anarchist bloc in our organization. In the end, General Secretary Marx sent the First International Executive Committee to the USA, where all 19 sections of North American communists did as Marx bid and in 1876 dissolved it altogether, creating their own Workingmen's Party. Go to Part 3 below to pick this up. Reign of Thieves. In power in Catalonia and Andalusia, the anarchist CNT began the wholesale introduction of its doctrine. Our party leader in Spain, Dolores Ibárruri, known in Spain as La Pasionaria for her passionate speeches in support of the Republic and against fascism in the Republican Cortes Parliament, described the social order set up by the anarchists in their part of Spain to be a reign of thieves. What did she mean? Where the anarchist armed gangs could grab power, they immediately redistributed all the wealth, giving that taken from the rich to the poor. But on day 2 they had no program. They abolished private property and abolished money, currency. Their military arrangements were just as primitive. The problem they created was first in the alienation of everyone, including workers and poor farmers who had a tiny bit of private property and wanted to hold on to it. The second was they eliminated money, so how could exchange occur for any farmers, small or large? The third was their idea of governing was a kind of rolling mass chaos. We had a war to win and we needed to mobilize the entire progressive bourgeoisie behind a Marxist worker-led movement. The anarchists with their silly radical programs were alienating large numbers of people the Republic needed on its side and without whom success in preserving democracy was seriously in doubt. Practical problem of revisionism in 1888. A second international was in the process of formation in Germany. Eventually it would become the biggest party, German Social Democratic Party, of Marxists in Europe. It went immediately off onto the wrong road. Ironically, this party declared itself Marxist and, in fact, to be the model Marxist workers' party for the rest of the advanced capitalist world. This had been on the table for a long time, and the organizers had asked Karl Marx for his imprimatur, prior to his 1883 death. Marx, however, had declined the offer to be official intellectual chief and denounced their program from the moment of its formation. Ironic, is it not, that the man they called the genius and scientific master never considered any of the factions within German social democracy to be his? Let's say it again, Marx never considered any of the German factions to be Marxists, although he maintained friendly relations with many German socialists as individuals. Marx said to his daughter and son-in-law, about the revisionism of the German Social Democrats, to paraphrase, "If what they are is Marxist, then I am certainly no Marxist." Initially Marx lost out to these revisionists, who managed to keep control of the political aspect of the labor movement, not only in Germany, but in most of Europe. Inevitably these revisionists entered into a de facto political alliance with European capitalists denouncing revolution and advocating evolutionary change towards socialism. In exchange they got seats in parliament, and a lot of cosmetic changes they wanted. What the capitalists got was a conforming labor movement at home and a labor movement in support of its imperialist adventures abroad. Marx was stunned by this development, and had a great deal to say about revisionism in the movement, claiming him as its ideological father, as in his 1875 critique of the Gotha program, where he formalizes his break with emerging German social democracy. But published only years later, after his 1883 death. That is, in his struggle to educate the Germans he preferred to give them time. Marxists did not publish this Gotha critique immediately. It would not see the light of day for 16 years. Practical problems of orthodox Marxism. Other Marxists also did not buy the revisionist opportunist nonsense, and kept on the right road. Most important among these was V.I. Lenin and his followers in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which split between its own revisionists and the Leninists. The latter went on to create their own Bolshevik party, as we have seen. The point being, when they, the revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, had the opportunity, they went altogether international again, for the third time, and created the Third International, the Communist International or Comintern. The Russian Empire included many nationalities, and the Bolshevik Party naturally was led by men from a multiple group of nationalities other than Great Russian. So, the Russian revolutions of 1905, February 1917, and most importantly October 1917, consisted of multiple national groups working together en masse and in their leadership. Furthermore, as the counter-revolution launched the civil war in the Russian Empire, troops were recruited by the Bolsheviks from a multitude of nationalities and sent to fight at fronts far from their homes. Felix Dzerzhinsky had the habit of sending Chekists originating from oppressed nationalities to areas in the Russian Civil War where their enemies were also the immediate enemies of the Red Army, as in the Ukraine, with its massive anarchist Black Flag Army, where Dzerzhinsky sent Jews to handle the reactionaries for the Cheka. The anarchist army, which had to be liquidated root and branch, also featured pogromists of the Black Hundred anti-Semite variety. Why? If it isn't obvious, it was because Dzerzhinsky knew he didn't have to tell these men and women of Jewish origin why these Black Hundreds and their allies had to be liquidated as a category, root and branch. He didn't have to worry about them getting soft on these class enemies of Bolshevism. The anarchist army was defeated and liquidated in a series of set-piece battles, the like of which we would not have to undertake again until the Spanish Civil War. The incoming Red Boss of the Ukraine was Christian Rakovsky. Rakovsky stayed in charge of purifying the Ukraine and introducing the Bolshevik program there, until picked by Lenin to go to Rapallo as part of the team he sent to negotiate with the victors of the First World War over the many issues confronting the Soviet Republic and these cap powers. As the post-Civil War years set in, the Bolsheviks continued to build massive international support in the form of the rapidly expanding Third International, and especially its secret arm. Within the Comintern, the Cheka played the most important and secret role. Capitalism evolved into its fascist phase in Europe, and country after country fell to one fascist conspiracy or another. First Hungary under Admiral Horthy, then Italy under Mussolini, Portugal under Dr. Salazar, and Germany under Hitler. The Bolshevik government in Russia, now the Soviet Union, responded with all sorts of internationalist interventions, open and surreptitious as we have seen. Back at the Spanish hacienda, Spain presented the entire world, however, with a new specter. That of a bourgeoisie split in half and a working class split four ways. The fascist specter of Spain under Franco emerged by mid-1936 when the diminutive general from North Africa began his campaign to overthrow the liberal bourgeois government in Madrid. Around the world, not only in Spain, the cause of anti-fascism, which is to say of bourgeois parliamentary democracy, finally got its much-needed second wind. This time ready to help were the workers no matter under what leadership, at least at first. In Spain this resulted in a rickety alliance of liberal bourgeois and patriotic nationalist capitalist elements with communists, independent, Marxists, anarchists and Trotskyists. Stalin's decision to avoid the red-baiting traps his enemies among the capitalists and Trotskyists were setting, most dangerously would be sending the Red Army and Navy to defend the Spanish Republic, sent instead international brigades. This was a continuation of the policy of international working-class action where the battle of one group of workers was also the battle of all of the workers of the world. The Canadians and the US Americans who went to Spain were quickly publicized and popularized by the capitalist press as well as the Daily Worker. New York and London both had CPs with newspapers of that name, and indeed saved the Republic in the fascists' first attempt to take Madrid in November of 1936 and thereafter stabilized all the Madrid fronts, and it would not fall to Franco until after they were withdrawn October 30, 1938. 5 months after our withdrawal the Republic collapsed, April 1, 1939. Among the North Americans was longtime U.S. Communist Steve Nelson, who by most accounts became by far the best commander the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, ex-VTH International Brigade, ever had. Spain reborn in me. By the time I met Steve in 1963, the Civil War in Spain had been over for 24 years. In January 1963, Steve Nelson was the party boss for the Northwest districts in the USA. Washington and Idaho were one CUSA district and Oregon another. He was so quiet and behind the scenes that I did not realize for some months after joining the CUSA in the Oregon district that our leaders Don Hammerquist and Susan Wheeler were actually under Steve's authority. But the point is, over the next year Steve Nelson taught me as much as any human being, after Carlos Prieto, about the ins and outs of clandestine operations in hostile territory, where the party is either outlawed or operating under more or less de facto, illegal, conditions. I realized in the time I knew Steve on a daily basis, he was living in Coos Bay, Oregon in these years, how important Spain had been. Not only for him but for the party as a whole as a training ground for true lifelong revolutionaries. It was here they were often first-blooded, in class war, and where they learned the meaning of discipline and devotion to the cause. Method and technique is a subject for another book at another time. Lessons for today. For our purposes and with regard to the possibility of a North American battalion being formed once more for action in Latin America to help revolutionary forces and governments. Despite the October 15, 2017 Chavista electoral victory, imperialism maintains a course of armed intervention, therefore a contingent of foreign fighters might soon be useful in Venezuela. It would be excellent training if those willing were injected into the cauldron of real class war. A war which always exists in battlefields such as that still raging in Colombia despite the most recent attempt to put an end to the civil war there. This is something you revolutionary cadre should consider. Stalin vs. Trotsky 7. The Cheka creates Trotskys. Fourth International 1938. Stalin was a very shrewd politician and he always knew that Trotsky was impotent politically in the USSR and internationally. In fact, he had let him live precisely because he was impotent and also a perfect straw man. During the critical years when Stalin was struggling to suppress opposition to his line and method of governing at home and abroad, it was extremely convenient to have Trotsky at hand as the whipping boy for every offense committed against the boss and his leadership. At hand, meaning nearby in Turkey, or Europe, or even Mexico. On the other hand, both Stalin and Trotsky well knew that even a person with a minuscule following could be dangerous if objective conditions were to shift in such a way that said person could suddenly emerge as the voice of a dangerous class opposition. So Stalin always knew the day would come when he would have to remove Trotsky from the face of the earth. Accordingly, Stalin always had Trotsky, his son and entourage, under the closest, if secret, supervision by top Cheka agents. When Trotsky decided to create the Fourth International, he did not know it was to be run from the very beginning by Chekists from top to bottom. The job of running it Stalin handed to Orlov's friend Yasha Serebrynsky, chief of the Cheka's administration for special tasks, Stalin's hitters, whose European central office was in Paris, France. Serebrynsky's top man for this job was Trotsky's main man in Europe named Mark Zborowski. Zborowski was the editor of Trotsky's main newspaper, the Bulletin of the Opposition, published in Paris, where he was also head of Trotsky's entire organization. He was beyond suspicion in the minds of Trotsky and his son, Lev Sedov. Zborowski had only one potential rival, and he was a man who was loyal to Trotsky and accordingly had to die. His name was Rudolf Clement. It happened just before the Trots had a founding convention. Trotsky's directive to form the Fourth International in December 1937 led to a September 1938 pathetic gathering in France of a handful of delegates from a small number of countries. These delegates were either direct Cheka agents or under close supervision by hidden Chekists. In the latter regard, Trotsky's eventual assassin Ramon Mercader was present with his girlfriend, the U.S. Trotskyist Sylvia Engelhoff. Rudolf Clement was selected by Trotsky to be the first secretary of the Fourth International, but was assassinated by the Special Task Hitters on July 28, 1938 in Paris, France, where his body was found on the banks of the Seine River. He would be unavailable in September. The way was cleared for Zborowski. Trotsky himself had only 2 years to live before he was hunted down in Mexico City. Reality check. Real world of 1939. The Eastern Front. Japan attacks Mongolia. Back at the Mongolian ranch, in the national capital, Red Flag, Ulaanbaatar, the party bosses were worried. The spring had begun, and the Japanese continued their military testing of Mongolian frontiers with China, in one armed provocation after another. The Mongolian Bolshevik Party leader Khorloogiin Khoibilsan was a personal friend of Comrade Stalin, and he and the rest of the Mongolian Communist Party's Politburo had cabled Stalin asking for specific military commitments along the Khakin-Jiol River frontier with China. You may recall, by this time the Japanese capitalists had occupied large sections of China, including all of Manchuria, large sections of which bordered on the People's Republic of Mongolia. Then, only 1 month after Franco declared victory in April 1939, the Japanese capitalists had attacked socialism's eastern frontier at a village along the Mongolian river Khakin-Jiol that formed the Chinese-Mongolian border. The fighter planes perfected in the air war over Spain were in factory mass production and backed up by still more planes being further perfected according to the doctrine of deep battle itself perfected in actual wartime experience in Spain. The same was true for the Armor Corps, which had been by far the best in Spain, and was being further perfected back home in the Soviet Union when the Japs attacked. The point is, the affair in Spain was directly connected to the opening shots of the Second World War, which happened to be fired in the east, not the west, and where it was Japan attacking first, not the long-awaited English-French-German-Italian attack which had most worried Stalin. Stalin knew he had to avoid at all costs a two-front war, which he well knew was the endgame strategy for the Western capitalists. During the spring of that fateful year, 1939, while the attention of the West was riveted on Hitler and his next move, the Japanese capitalists prepared a massive attack on the Soviet Union and Mongolia. They began May 11, initiating incursions into Allied Soviet territory at the Chinese-Mongolian Khakin-Jiol River border, launching its main phase July 3. The Mongolian bosses were more worried perhaps than they should have been. The boss had the situation well in hand. Stalin's chief spy in Japan, Richard Sorg, embedded as an SS officer in the Nazi embassy in Tokyo, told him, via his secret radio system, that the Japanese were playing out a scenario at the highest level. One group of Japanese imperialists wanted to attack north and secure Siberia from Lake Baikal east for Japan. The other Nipponese imperialist leaders wanted to attack south, gaining more of China, as well as Indochina, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. The attack on Mongolia was the test that would determine which faction won out. Stalin pounds Japan's invasion force to dust. Stalin believed, based on Sorga's intelligence, the Japanese did not have modern equipment, and they relied upon suicidal troops to accomplish their missions. Accordingly, he directed his hand-picked General George Zhukov to prepare a counter-offensive of a special type. Stalin gave Zhukov the most advanced tanks and ground attack fighter bomber warplanes the USSR had, including those straight out of prototype design phase, shipped straight from their design institutes and manufacturing plants to the desert war zone. Zhukov was confident that this modern armament combined with infantry superiority would give Bolshevism victory. In August 1939, General Zhukov was ready. While building up for the counterattack, the Red Army had successfully kept the Japanese busy with the stall and retreat strategy. Now the time had come to kick some ass. On the 20th of August 1939, only 10 days before Hitler attacked Poland, Zhukov delivered a smashing rebuff to the Japanese invaders at the Khakin-Jiol River, using advanced Soviet deep operations tactics. Deep battle featured squares of tanks moving against the Japanese flanks and rear. These were supported by ground attack fighter bombers, along with a massive infantry frontal attack. 2 to 1, 60,000 to 30,000 men in the Soviet and Japanese main forces went head-to-head. The Japanese had no advanced warplanes of Soviet caliber, or any advanced heavy tanks, and worst of all, no adequate anti-tank weaponry of any kind. In so doing, Zhukov liquidated Japan's entire main force, including those who failed to surrender between the 27th and 31st of August 1939, sending what was left of their total 80,000-man expeditionary force reeling back into Manchuria minus their armor, artillery, and remnant air force. The next day, September 1, 1939, Hitler attacked Poland, and accordingly the world ignored the fact that Japan had been wiped out in its adventure against the USSR. Of course, none of the European cap countries had any idea about what was going on in East Asia, with no correspondence on the ground of any kind. Japan's million-man reserves, waiting to move into Siberia, however, witnessed deep battle firsthand while waiting in Manchuria, and they sat dumb. They were not nearly as well equipped as their expeditionary spearhead that had just suffered Japan's first smashing defeat of World War II. Although the Soviets would not be in the war with Japan until August 1945. Pearl Harbor now inevitable. According to Sorg, the Japanese High Command was stunned by the Soviet counterattack, concluding the readiness of the Red Army was of a far higher quality than they had imagined. The Japanese gave up once and for all on the northern strategy and decided to strike south against the USA, UK, France and the Dutch, in pursuit of all of their colonies and the rest of China. Herein lay the inevitability of Pearl Harbor. If Hitler had been paying attention, he would have seen what was waiting for him in the Soviet West. But he wasn't. While Stalin's ploy did not stop the Nazi assault, but along with their upcoming difficulties in their Balkan campaign, the Red Army's shockingly effective assault on Japan's best forces came as an upset to Hitler's generals. They delayed it until the summer solstice of 1941. The Japanese were so badly mauled the Jap general staff would never again consider getting into that conflict even when the Germans appeared to be heading to victory. Lenin's Far East policy succeeds. In the meantime, in China, Mao Zedong's hand-picked Communist Party General Lin Biao launched the 100 Regiments Party Army attack. It dealt death and destruction on the left flank of the Japanese army garrisoned in Manchuria as well as north-central China, the Chinese heartland. The Jap response was to launch the Three Alls campaign, which massacred 22 million Chinese between 1941 and 1943. A holocaust nearly 4 times greater than what the Germans did to the Jews. However, the expanded war in North China between the Communists and the Japanese army had the effect of securing Stalin's Siberian frontier, by tying down all of Japanese imperialism's armed forces. China thereby fulfilling Lenin's hope for an eastern frontier nation, allied with the Soviet Union against imperialism. Also, the Japanese genocide against China fed huge numbers of volunteers into what was to become the Chinese People's Liberation Army, PLA. Meanwhile, the fascist regime of Chiang Kai-shek continued its refusal to fight Japan. The Communists continuing as the only indigenous Chinese force fighting Japan's invasion. In the end, the Chiang fascists escaped to Taiwan and established their fascist regime there against the people of that sorry island. The movie Formosa Betrayed, 2010, gives an exciting dramatic cinematic view of this event. Western Front revisited German attack on USSR stalled. The German capitalists, unified under the Nazis, struck out at Britain and France, September 1, 1939, using the Polish War as the excuse. Even after Poland went under, and Britain and France were technically at war with Germany, they didn't do much of anything. Their phony war was in reality the last phase of their wishful thinking about Hitler. Still hoping not to provoke the Führer, hoping that he would keep going to the east. But in the Far East, the Japanese capitalists sued for peace on September 16. Stalin made every possible effort to forge an alliance with Britain and France to contain Hitler, but every effort was rebuffed. Including the one at the last minute in July and August of 1939, when Stalin made tremendous overtures to both the French and British regimes for a collective security agreement against Nazi Germany. Disappointingly, that initiative resulted in the London government sending a low-ranking delegation by slow boat to Murmansk. And from France, no response at all. Stalin then directed Molotov to seek a non-aggression treaty with Germany. It succeeded and the USSR avoided war. The greed and fanaticism of the British and French ruling classes had blinded them to the possibility, nay certainty, that Hitler would strike against them first and finish the unfinished business of the First World War, simultaneously bringing both France and England into the Nazi orbit. Hitler almost succeeded. Inside Snapshot 1939. Tying loose ends. Katyn moved into Poland and Eastern Europe, and Soviet attack units moved closer to the new Soviet-German frontier. Along the way there were other fascists to be dealt with. Some of the worst were in Poland, in the officer class of the feudal army. This class of parasitical bloodsuckers had reduced Polish workers to virtual slaves and committed every imaginable crime against the working people of Poland. Most importantly, they were our most lethal enemies in that part of the world, and we would have to fight them again, sooner or later. As it happened, they fortuitously ended up in our hands, and that was the end of them. It happened this way. The boss was meeting with Cheka chief Lavrenti Beria. Lavrenti. Our troops have occupied the agreed-upon territory along the old Curzon line, as you know. What you may only be learning about is the arrival of many thousands of fascist Polish officers on our territory, running from the Krauts. These are our most deadly enemies in Poland, and I want them dealt with as we did with similar elements in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, and most recently in Finland. Deportation? No. That's what I mean. Similar elements. Fascist infectious parasites. Deportation and the chance to start over the right way is fine for the normal bourgeois elements, especially the recalcitrant petty bourgeois farmers. But these fascist Polish army officers are deadly infectious germs. They are sworn to our destruction. There is no rehabilitation possible here. They are the leftovers of our defeat at Warsaw in 1920. We owe it to them. This is a special category of enemy equivalent to the Black Death. I have no intention of giving them any more of a break than they have given the millions of our fellow workers and farmers in Poland, who they have raised like farm animals except without as much kindness. Not to mention the fact that these are the ones who killed my wife. Besides, as soon as the war with Germany starts, they will be back on the side of reaction, helping the Nazis if we leave them alive now. We will just have to kill them later if we don't do it now, and they will take a lot of our men with them since they will have guns and be part of the fascist assault. Anyway, on the main point, revenge is often a dish best served cold. You know what to do. Yes. I have already sent 4 divisions of NKVD troops to Katan to take the situation in hand. These divisions are made up of hardcore communists, mostly of Jewish extraction. There are some 20,000 of those fascist motherfucking Poles there so far, Koba. Good thinking. Felix used to do the same thing in the Ukraine. We won't have to worry about those men and women getting soft on these Black Hundred type of scum. Just be sure their poor kids are sent directly to our orphanages. If they aren't orphans yet, they will be in a few days. Anyway, can you handle it? Yes. It will take a couple of days. We'll get to it and step it up. My weather forecasters tell me permafrost is at most 48 hours away at Katan. This should be completely over before the ground freezes. I have meetings until midnight. Then join us in the Kremlin if you like. I've got a new Chaplin movie. Thank you, Koba. I'll see you then. 1940. www.amazon.com. Then, in 1940, in a lightning strike, Hitler moved against Scandinavia, Benelux, and into France. Using the plans provided to him by England's one-time king, the Duke of Windsor, a long-time Nazi. CN Note 35. The Nazi Duke. In my book The Buccaneer, 2003, Jason W. Smith, Writers Press, Boise 330 pp, or in ebook form at Kindle Books. www.amazon.com. The Nazi spearhead circumvented the Maginot Line, then found French commanders helpfully withdrawing, inviting the Nazis to take their country. It was the typical, fifth column, betrayal the world had gotten used to seeing by the big capitalists and their bourgeois allies against their respective nations, hoping that the fascists would be good enough to liquidate their organized labor movement when they took over. Which of course they did. British troops could have been rolled up by the Nazis while they lay trapped in France at Dunkirk, but Hitler was absolutely certain that this last of the parliamentary regimes of capitalist Europe would see reason and surrender to his forces. He stopped. Then he got the big surprise. Britain's new PM, Winston Churchill, with his perfect command of European history, and his worldliness that came from having been all over Africa and Asia in his youth as part of one military campaign or another, and a brief stint as a prisoner of war in an Afrikaner camp from which he escaped, was not afraid of labor so much as he was of Hitler. A good anti-communist himself, he saw the Soviet Union as far less of a threat to Great Britain than the Nazis. He had no intention of making a deal with the gutter-snipe Hitler. Churchill, being the son of a lord, was quite class-conscious and not at all likely to make a deal with a poor white trash nincompoop like Hitler to take over his realm. At the same time, he was sufficiently worried about the communists to read the London Daily Worker every day. Churchill rescued his army in France and began a determined fight to save Britain and destroy Hitler. Comeuppance Stalin vs. Trotsky, 8 May 1, 1940. I have one more thing, Koba. Speaking was Lavrenti Beria. Go ahead, responded the boss. Siqueiros is going to be able to get to the Antichrist. How is that? Rivera's home was a perfect sanctuary for him. It is well guarded because of Diego and because President Cardenas has wanted him secure. But the scumbag Trotsky has had a sexual affair with the wife, Frida Kahlo, of his host Diego Rivera. Thus, Trotsky and Rivera have had a falling out, which is currently assumed to be political, except among those in the household, whereas you know we have an agent waiting. President Cardenas is disgusted and will now stand aside. See the Salma Hayek-produced movie Frida. It is much better for a Mexican of the caliber of Siqueiros to handle this if at all possible, commented the boss. Of course. I hope Siqueiros will, but you know what these guys are like, big mouths, short on thinking and planning. Well, if necessary, pull out Ramon Mercator. We have to tie off all the loose ends before this war starts. Is his mother with him? Yes, she is, working directly with Nahum, aka Leonid Eidingen. Koba, I just wanted you to know that Trotsky moved to another home in the Koyokan locality, much easier for us to attack, which we will be able to handle. Either with this fumble-bum Siqueiros or with our own agent. Anyway, it's just a matter of days or a few weeks now. There is a 2009 biography entitled The Eidingens by Mary Kay Wilmers. What are the chances of getting Ramon out alive? Not good. He thinks he may be able to kill Trotsky silently and make his escape, but I suspect this is wishful thinking. I hate to leave a great comrade like Ramon to that fate if there is any way to help him exit. No, I know you can't do anything more than you are doing. But you know what I mean. Keep me informed. Of course. And if there is nothing else? No, Lavrenti. As usual, you are doing a superb job. Felix would be proud of you. As I am. Thank you, Koba. That's the nicest thing you ever said to me. One of my worst failings lies in my failing to acknowledge great contributions. If I haven't said so before, I apologize. Oh, that's not necessary, Koba. I'd better go. What had just happened passed into history for Stalin as an afterthought of a long day at work. But for Beria it was the beginning of a new day. Koba never complimented people like that unless he really meant it. Why now? We have seen that Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky hated each other, and had from the beginning of the Bolshevik movement, to which Trotsky had always been an enemy until 4 months before the October Revolution. But why kill him now in 1940? Why not much earlier, as Stalin could easily have arranged? I believe the answers to both questions are rather obvious once you stop and think about it. Trotsky was so arrogant and personally repugnant to most of the Bolshevik party members high and low that having him as an enemy was actually helpful. Furthermore, as time proceeded and Trotsky was in exile on Principe Island or Europe or Mexico, he and his followers kept up enough of a racket with their small-time press and political rallies and parties that the international communist movement had no difficulty in accepting Stalin's ongoing main proposition that he and the USSR had internal fifth columnists and enemies at every gate. But, as the inevitable World War II came closer, Stalin did not want to take the chance that Trotsky would raise a false flag, creating one more enemy out of some of those who should be supporting the USSR. And true to form, the Trot newspaper, the Militant in New York, called for Stalin's overthrow as Nazi troops were driving on Moscow. Trotsky had long ago joined the ranks of Judas Iscariot and Benedict Arnold and was certainly not above making a deal with the Nazis, if he thought it would help him regain power. Accordingly, Trotsky now had to die. And he did, just 10 months before the Soviet Union was at war with Germany. Trotsky dies August 20, 1940. Trotsky did not have long to live. First, Sikeros tried to kill him with a squad of gunmen who poured roughly 100 rounds into his bedroom window on May 23, 1940. Beria's fears proved accurate, as Sikeros and crew fucked up what should have been a simple enough hit, and even with Eidingen escorting them to the gate, where an undercover agent opened the door. In the event, Sikeros, despite all his good intentions, proved to be no more skilled in these black arts, in his home country, than he had been in military ones in Spain. Trotsky managed to escape by hiding under the bed. The assassins failing to enter the bedroom to be sure they had done the job. Nevertheless, Sikeros was a great red artist and left a lasting impression in his revolutionary murals in Mexico. All who travel there see them to this very day. On August 20, 1940, Beria pulled out his undercover agent Ramon Mercader, who buried an ice pick in Trotsky's head. However, escape for Ramon was impossible, as Trotsky let out a blood-curdling shriek. Mercader later said he would never forget. Mercader was captured by Trotsky's Minneapolis Teamster bodyguards and turned over to the Mexican police, who brought him to trial. His boss Leonid Eidingen had been waiting outside in a car, along with Mercader's longtime associate and mother. Both had to beat a retreat. Mother Mercader made her way to Moscow and received a hero's welcome. She lived quietly in Moscow on a Chaika pension, an apartment consulting on Spain and Mexico, until she died. Her death being before her son was able to finish his 20-year Mexican prison term. Stalin must have found it amusingly ironic that Mercader killed Trotsky with a mountain climbing tool, ice pick, after decades of snide abuse from Trotsky, who never failed to describe him as a mountain climber, as if this athletic endeavor is all he was ever good for. Now Trotsky died by the mountain climbing ice pick. I don't know about Stalin, but I would have found this cold revenge immensely satisfying. We do know that Stalin was publicly pleased because in absentia Joseph Stalin presented Ramon Mercader with the Order of Lenin. And his accomplice and mother Caridad del Rio Hernandez also received the Order of Lenin from Stalin. The bullet holes and the blood on the floor from the ice pick attack have been preserved, along with the home itself, for those wishing to visit this Coyoacan suburb of Mexico City home, now a museum. Carlos Prieto later made a documentary movie about this entire matter and brought me in on all the essential details a half-century ago. In the aftermath, the Trotskyists tried to make a big deal out of the assassination by trying to prove Stalin had given the order. Not that there was any doubt in anyone's mind about who gave the order. Especially after Stalin gave the imprisoned Mercader the Order of Lenin, and gave the Order of Lenin to his mother Caridad del Rio Hernandez. But in the latter part of 1940, the imperialists were at war with each other in Europe. The Nazis were preparing to attack the Soviet Union, and were being actively encouraged to do so by the rotten British and French ruling capitalist oligarchy. Trotsky passed into history without very many caring very much. On May 6, 1960, Mercator completed his 20-year Mexican sentence and was released. He flew first to Havana and then on to Moscow, where in 1961 Nikita Khrushchev personally greeted him, and the Cheka, then the KGB, awarded him the Medal Hero of the Soviet Union. Mercator passed some of his remaining days in Moscow on a generous Cheka pension with a suitable apartment, but he spent most of his remaining years in Cuba. He had acquired considerable knowledge about Latin America from the unique perspective available only to political prisoners in a high-security Mexican prison, so he continued his Cheka, KGB, work as a contract consultant on Latin America and as a consultant for the Cuban DGI until his death of old age. Presumably the Cubans found him helpful, and of course by this time he had become quite at home with Latin American culture, and was after all a Spanish speaker to begin with. I have often said that I never met any real intellectuals until I went to Mexico in 1962. I had certainly never met many in Idaho, with such exceptions as Dan Bunnell, Gideon Oppenheimer, Art and Kathy Troutner, Merle Wells and Frank Church, and my age mates Barry Marcus and Carol McGregor. However, that may still be an exaggeration, because I had met real intellectuals in London, working for the BBC in 1961. I was only there for the month of June, leaving London the day before the baby was born that became Princess Diana years later. I have described that event under the subhead, Lady X, the closest friend of Mother Spencer, in my autobiography The Buccaneer. So it was in Mexico City that I met intellectuals by the bushel, so to speak, via the good offices of the well-known Mexican playwright and communist, and one-time Soviet and later Cuban agent, Carlos Prieto Argels. Type a crime against the lambs into your browser for photos, and his surviving daughter Ayari Prieto Stock's biographical sketch of this great Mexican revolutionary. My experiences with these people changed my life because, for the first time, I realized I was not a part of a permanently inferior class, my intellectual predilection for Marxism, but part of the most advanced class of thinking people in the world. There had been no turning back for me anyway. I had chosen my side, and nothing could dissuade me from my scientifically derived decision. But meeting hundreds of people who thought the same way I did, for the same reasons, was a wonderful change in the world as far as I was concerned. Trotsky's last love. I mention this here because a very fine example of this class, the Mexican intelligentsia, and the general milieu of those times are shown in the 2002 Salma Hayek-produced movie Frida, about the wife of Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, starring Salma Hayek, Alfred Molino, and Geoffrey Rush. This is the first time, in the bourgeois movie industry, of which I am aware, where Frida's sexual episode with Trotsky is explored. Left movie makers seem to have been allergic to describing Trotsky's simple human failing in this regard. Perhaps because these de facto left petty bourgeois intellectuals found it natural to conclude it was this piggishness on Trotsky's part which led directly to his death. I think this is extremely ungenerous. After all, after what he had been through, Trotsky had to be in fragile shape, and perhaps Ms. Kahlo really helped him. The fact that Trotsky's wife was with him during this affair, in the same household, and we know he felt very bad about that, makes me think, even more so, that he was not emotionally stable by this time. I think history tells us why. Stalin had left him alive but stripped of just about everything. His self-confidence, and perhaps his manhood, had to be in personal question. To me, Trotsky at this point in his life is a person to be pitied, not hated. Lenin himself, after all, had brought Trotsky on board initially. Lenin had had to see some good qualities in Trotsky. And in fact, Trotsky did perform useful services until he lost out on the succession altogether. Stalin was a man who never forgot a slight, a man who never failed to remember a hurt, a man who was exceptionally sensitive to what others might have risen above, e.g., snide class background comments, however saw him through the glasses of hurt and sensitivity. For Stalin, his nemesis had become the author of all Trotskyite conspiracies, real and imagined. Of course, Trotsky had made himself into Stalin's political nemesis, and brought this upon himself. With World War II imminent, Trotsky was a false flag raiser. And now accordingly, Trotsky had to die. At any rate, the Frida movie is based on the book by Ms. Hayden Herrera. Anyway, the point is the producers got everything in the production values exactly right. I would highly recommend this movie to get an idea of the cultural setting of the Mexican intelligentsia, which was still virtually unchanged when I arrived in Mexico City at the beginning of September in 1962. I have described some of this in The Buccaneer, Volume 1 of my autobiography. Idaho Smiths. Search for the Foundation. Who will attack first? The imperialist war against the Soviet Union could not be delayed forever. One could jockey only so long until it would be a reality. And Stalin had been doing his best to gain strategic advantage on his western borders, moving Soviet attack forces closer and closer to those borders, and demanding and getting territorial concessions. Stalin was preparing the option of striking the Nazis first. In the beginning of 1941, Stalin needed to wait one more year, or perhaps 18 months. Why? for the newest Spanish Civil War-derived T-34 land tanks and the Sturmovik aerial tanks to be produced in sufficient numbers to guarantee victory. The spring of 1941 turned to summer. The fascist regimes on Soviet borders were told what to do or else. Bulgaria was to provide access to its rivers and Romania was required to surrender certain adjacent territories to the Soviet Union. Galicia was largely incorporated into the western Ukraine. Other defensive steps had been taken against Nazi-supported fascist Finland, while the reactionary regimes in Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia were eliminated when Soviet troops occupied them in the fall of 1939. Germany continued to be tied up in combat in Greece and now Yugoslavia. May 1, 1941 Stalin orders, spoiling attack. Vlad, since we don't know what the Nazis may be planning on our frontiers, and there's way too much movement too close to our western border, this possibility of launching a major Yugoslav offensive is of critical importance. Tell Tito to attack them now. In the spring of 1941, Joseph Stalin's old friend Joseph Broz Tito came to the boss's rescue by launching a deadly counteroffensive against Nazi troops in Serbia. This delayed the German assault on the Soviet Union for 5 critical weeks. You will recall Tito was last seen in this book in Paris, where he guided the inflow of fighter volunteers, the internationals, to the Republican camp at Albacete, Spain. In the interim, Stalin had sent him home to Yugoslavia, to begin preparations for the liberation of that sorry country, still suffering under the jackboot of its own ruling class. Therefore, he was in place to organize and lead the attack on occupying Nazi troops in the spring of 1941 that delayed Hitler's assault on the USSR for these critical 5 weeks. Before Tito's war against the Nazis concluded in 1944, 1.4 million Yugoslavs, 10% of the Yugoslav population, would be murdered by the master race. Nazi attack finally gets underway June 22, 1941. On June 22, 1941, the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union. Hitler had been almost as good as his word. He just waited until he thought he had secured his western frontier before turning against the Bolsheviks on his eastern one. Along the way, Hitler took his European allies with him in this desperate adventure. The people of these countries would rue the day they allowed that decision, and among their soldiers no more than a handful would return home alive. For example, Spanish fascist troops, victorious in Spain, would be liquidated in totality in Russia. Why? Because Franco had joined the Anti-Comintern Pact and sent several divisions of Spanish troops against the USSR in Hitler's surprise attack. They would die and never see home again. Contrary to imperialist propaganda, Stalin entered the war with the advantage. He had only to fight the great capitalist powers one front at a time, and in the meantime had neutralized the others. This was the final triumphant advantage, as the decades-long program of unified capitalist attack against the Soviet Union had been definitively destroyed by the equally decades-long Leninist foreign policy of Rapallo, i.e., keeping the cap countries divided. Soviet Neo-Napoleonic Battle Plan June 22, 1941 to December 5, 1941. Since 1917, the Soviet Union had been preparing for this capitalist assault against the homeland of the world socialist stage. We reviewed the publication of P. Karatajin's 1924 General Foundations of the Mobilization of Industry for the Needs of War textbook for the Red Army and Mikhail Frunze's Introduction Front and Rear in Future War in Chapter 12. By 1941, all of the necessary preliminary steps in the unification of the Red Army and Navy with the essential civilian industrial base had been accomplished. Dividing imperialist encirclement. We saw in Chapter 10 how the supportive Soviet foreign policy had begun in 1922 at Rapallo and continued for 19 years, until June 22, 1941. As tricky as the entire strategy had been, it had been made successful. Germany had been kept from allying with the other imperialist states, and Japan's adventurous militarism humiliatingly defeated. European mirror image is just the same. Then in June 1941 the Leninist foreign policy continued, although this time it featuring the USSR allied with the English-speaking world against world fascism. Maintained was the Rapallo principle of keeping the imperialist countries divided. Remember, imperialist, in Marxist terminology, means the highest phase of the capitalist stage. As far as preventing a joint attack against the USSR was concerned, it began with a bloc between the Soviet Republic and Germany against the victors of World War I. After the Hitlerites attacked the USSR June 22, 1941, Lenin's policy continued as a bloc with the USA and its Latin American de facto colonies, and England and its empire. Lenin and his successors knew that another world war was inevitable and that capitalism would attack us eventually. In summary, the capitalist attack had to be made particulate. It was made so through 2 stages. 1. 2. The bloc with the English-speaking world. This began in June of 1941 with the Nazi attack on us and the immediate decision in Britain and the USA to support the USSR. Japan continuing to be afraid to confront us because of the lessons they learned at Kok and Gol 2 years earlier. Given our technological limitations, we wanted to fight the global capitalist stage one part at a time. One part of the world capitalist stage at a time meant one capitalist country or block of countries at a time. Stalin, for 20 years, had done everything humanly possible to prepare for the inevitable World War II. Now it had come, and the USSR had a war plan as well as a general mobilization strategy of what we have come to call People's War. 1, 2, 3. That plan began with the strategic overview of being able to assume the Eastern Front against Japan, and the USA would be neutralized. Then the USSR would have option A to attack the Western Alliance, meaning attack the Nazis first, or, now that the war had begun with the Germans making the first move, the Soviet Union had option B, which was to absorb the Western attack. This meant, now in practice, to absorb the 3.5 million man German attack with military and civilian resistance, slowing down the aggressor, while the Soviet High Command fought with stall and retreat tactics and prepared the counterstrike. This second option, B, then put forward the responding Soviet battle plan under the title, the Neo-Napoleonic Battle Plan. This plan was known only to the higher echelons of the party, the Stavka, Military High Command, and the Chaika, although the strategy was common knowledge and had been since 1924. The strategy had its foundation and fundamentals in Karatajin's textbook General Foundations and Frunze's introductory essay Front and Rear in Future War. Everything since that time had been built according to that doctrine and according to the tactical doctrine of deep battle or deep operations. You may wish to go back to Chapter 12 and review the historical debate over appropriations for the Red Army and Red Navy in the 1920s and the initial attempts to provide the funding for the Karatajin strategy. Then focus on the fact that it was only Stalin's revolution from above, which meant the strategy could finally be realized and made material. Option B, Neo-Napoleonic Battle Plan. 1. In the event, the USSR would have to conduct defensive war and absorb the incoming 3.5 million Nazi and satellite troops while preparing a counterstrike at Moscow. Along the way it would have to fortify both the northern and southern elements of the battle line, which would extend from Leningrad, St. Petersburg, Petrograd, to the Caucasus, Batum and Baku. 2. Every element of civil society as well as the military fronts would have to be involved. This meant the citizens of the great Soviet cities in the West would have to fight one way or another right alongside the Red Army. This was a modernized anti-Napoleon strategy, in that it would feature scorched earth from the western frontier to the stabilized front running from Leningrad to Moscow and south to Baku and Batum. 3. The Germans were getting weaker by the day as they expanded into the Soviet Union. At least 1 million of the 3.5 million soldiers they sent against socialism would die in the 6 months from June 22 to December 5. Their machinery was destroyed, worn out, and ultimately frozen. 4. Meanwhile, the Soviets moved a great deal of the Western industrial plant behind the Urals, where it was literally inserted into the top-secret military-industrial complex. All of this was done according to the Neo-Napoleonic Battle Plan Stalin and his generals had drawn up over the previous 17 years. Inherent to this plan was a modern People's War, in that the civilian population would not be evacuated. Instead, the party would have to see to it that the civilians fought too, whatever that meant, even if it meant just being in place and having to be taken prisoner or killed. The thinking behind this strategy and battle plan had begun with the publication of P. P. Karatajin's textbook General Foundations and the introduction by Red Army Chief of Staff and 1925 War Commissar, Mikhail Frunze, entitled Front and Rear in Future War. The strategic battle plan was to be concluded by the movement of available Red Army elite units into position behind Moscow, in order to launch a deep battle counterstrike at the moment the Aryans became most vulnerable. However, now in practice, with the Red Army engaged across this, thousands of miles long, main front, Stalin had only about 30 of these elite divisions, some 300,000 men, immediately available in reserve in the West for the counterstrike. This was not enough to guarantee the success of the Neo-Napoleonic battle plan. To do the job and reverse the Nazi assault, he needed to move another 40 elite divisions into position, some 400,000 men, from the anti-Japanese Mongolian front, and put them together with these 30 elite reserve divisions already near Moscow. The strategic battle plan would then call on the tactical doctrine of deep operations as perfected against the Japanese at the Battle of Kok-and-Gol 2 years earlier. This meant hitting the Germans with 70 divisions, hard and continuously, not only at the front, but also on their flanks and in the rear, making it impossible for them to regain their footing and dig in, leaving only retreat and or chaotic rout as a choice. The Germans retreated and chaotically ran. In the process, the Krauts lost 100 miles of territory, as the Red Army taught them what deep battle was all about. In the end, this battle plan worked perfectly, as intended and planned. But the cost was indeed quite high for us as well as for the incoming scum. This is how it happened. Inside Snapshot: Stalin with Zhukov, July 25, 1941. Pacing in his Kremlin office, Marshal, 5-star U.S. General rank Ed, and now Supreme Commander of all Soviet military forces, Joseph Stalin walked to the door, being opened by Poskrebyshev, extending his good right hand to grasp that of one-star Brigadier General George Zhukov, commander of the Far East Red Army District. The two men walked directly to the war map on the wall of the Stavka's Supreme Commander, Red Army High Command's Supreme Commander, i.e., Joseph Stalin, and gradually made their way to the couch at the side of the room the boss rarely used, and then only with his closest friends or most important conversationalists of the moment. "George, I made the decision to send you to the western frontier, and then to move our attack vanguard forces to that frontier in the west, in order to try and impress Hitler with the impossibility of launching a successful attack or to get ready for a first strike, as you know. Unfortunately, our preparations didn't work. If anything, they made Hitler think, correctly, if he was to have any chance at all, he had to attack us this year, and do so in such a way as to knock us out of the war by the onset of the holiday season. We lost 1,800 aircraft on the ground on the first day, George, and it gets worse with each passing day after that. Fortunately, these attack vanguard forces we lost were the oldest and least important aircraft. So, we will recover. Although, it will take a year to get our aircraft and tank factories producing to maximum capability behind the Urals. The only good part of this is that the Nazis made their main attack against our least important aircraft and tank forces. The truth is our best new Spanish experienced design air attack force, Sturmovix, and T-34 tank force is already being pushed into top priority overtime production and will be available in force next year. Between now and then, unless I can come up with military assistance from the United States, it will continue to be a massive GNP struggle to get re-equipped while the Red Army fights a defensive war of attrition and maneuver. What it comes down to is we can hold a line, here follow me, from Leningrad to Moscow and south to Batum. That is for this year, and probably next year, although the Germans are going to have to go for the oil sooner or later. At the moment, that oil is not their primary target. For whatever reason, they are coming straight for us here in Moscow. 500,000 of them at least I figure are left in their army group's center. We could turn this against them if you were to be able to move your entire main force from Siberia to Moscow in time to do another Kokkin-GOL type envelopment. But I can't move you unless I know the Japs aren't coming for us. I have a spy on the Japanese General Staff. They are meeting right now on this question. Jesus Christ! I mean, whatever it should be these days. I had no idea. No wonder you had the order of battle for Kokkin-GOL. Well, what do you think they will decide, to go for it or back off? I think they will back off, but the pressure from Berlin is powerful. We are countering it as best we can, but I am afraid we may lose our best agent if he keeps up what he is doing. I have asked him to risk it all in trying to convince the Japs not to go for German overtures to enter the war. His masters in Berlin SS could easily discover he is doing what he is doing, and that will be the end of our asset there. At any rate, if we can move your forces, how long will it take to get ready for an encirclement of the German army group's center?